Okay, good morning to everyone. My name is Gerasimos Rosados. I am the acting director of the Oil Conservation Division and also the acting chair for the Oil Conservation Commission. I would like to bring our meeting back in order. It was a continuation from, actually, it started on Thursday and yesterday and back into today. This is the consolidated cases by Goodnight Midstream and Empire, New Mexico that we are listening to. These are case numbers 24123, 23614 through 17, case number 23775, and case numbers 24018 through 24020 and 24025. Before we start, I want to definitely take a roll call. So if I could have the commissioners please state their names and that they're here.
Dr. William Ampuma, Professor, Petroleum Engineering at New Mexico Tech, Designee of the Energy Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Balin Lampkin, Petroleum Engineer, Designee of the Commissioner of Public Lands.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampkin. And as I said, I'm Gerasimos Rosados, and I'm the acting director for the Oil Conservation Division. So as we stated, this is a continuation of the evidentiary hearing. So we'll transfer it over to our hearings officer, Mr. Harwood. It's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rosados. Good morning, everybody. A couple of housekeeping matters. Just a reminder to self and others, phones to vibrate or silent. People who are attending via Zoom. We had a couple of inadvertent interruptions yesterday, I think resulting from people who did not observe the protocol of staying on mute while you're listening. So I'll remind people attending via Zoom to please do that. Second order of business is I'm advised that yesterday I asked if Dr. Lindsay could be excused, but we never got an answer because there were all sorts of questions and stuff. And then I forgot to get back around to it. So may Dr. Lindsay be excused, and I hope he's not just here because I didn't get an answer.
Yes.
All right, Pilot and Rice.
Yes. That's fine with Pilot.
And for OCD, yes.
All right, Doctor, this doesn't mean you have to leave. It just means you may if you wish. And if you're here just because we didn't get through that, my apologies. All right, I see a new face in the witness stand, and my guess is that would be Ryan Bailey.
That's correct, Mr. Examiner. Empire's next witness is Mr. Ryan Bailey.
All right, before we take it any further, let me make sure that we have a court reporter.
You have a court reporter.
And we are on the record?
And we've been on the record.
That's good to know.
Thank
All right.
you.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, before we start, over here, it's Jerry. Just make sure, everybody, that you bring the microphones close enough so that the audio can pick up. Yesterday, we were having some sound effect issues in this corner of the room, so it helps the witness as well to be able to hear better. So please bring the microphones closer so the witnesses can hear.
Is it Dr. or Mr. Bailey?
Mr. Bailey.
All right, Mr. Bailey, would you please raise your right hand?
Yes, sir.
You swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Bailey.
Morning.
Can you please state your full name for the record?
Ryan Michael Bailey.
Thank you. By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am the vice president and co-founder of Ops Geologic.
Have you previously testified before the commission?
I have not.
Can you please provide some information regarding your area of expertise?
I am a geoscientist focused mainly in reservoir characterization.
Have you provided a summary of your education, training, and experience with your direct test or with your testimony as Exhibit K56?
I have.
Commissioners, Mr. Hearing Examiner, based on Mr. Bailey's qualifications as set out here today and in his testimony, I request that he be qualified as an expert in geoscience, please.
No objection.
Sorry. Any objection from Goodnight?
No objection.
Pilot and Rice?
No objection. No objection from pilot.
OCD.
All right, he will be so recognized, Ms. Hardy.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, have you provided rebuttal testimony and exhibits in this case?
Yes, I have.
Whose testimony are you rebutting?
Preston McGuire.
Is there a specific topic of Mr. McGuire's that you're addressing?
Mainly his stratigraphic model, as well as various other things, including a barrier separating the San Andreas and the Grayburg, as well as other things that I probably have put in my rebuttal testimony.
Are you addressing Mr. McGuire's opinions regarding the depths of the San Andreas Formation?
Yes, most certainly.
And what about the existence of a residual oil zone or a ROZ within the San Andreas?
Most certainly.
Do you affirm today under oath that your testimony is true and correct?
Yes, I do.
Commissioners and Mr. Examiner, I request that Mr. Bailey's rebuttal testimony and exhibits, which are Exhibit K and sub-exhibits K1 through K56, be admitted into the record.
Goodnight's position.
This time we will not object. Mr. Examiner, I will question Mr. Bailey on the nature of his testimony, but at this time I will not object to their admission.
Okay, Rice,
No objection.
pilot,
No objections from pilot.
OCD.
No objection.
And OCD, I'm sorry, I keep omitting you. I didn't mean to, but you have no objection to Mr. Bailey being an expert witness?
OCD does not.
Fair enough. All right, they'll be admitted, Ms. Hardy.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, let's briefly go through some of the highlights of your testimony, and I will pull up the slides we're discussing here on the screen. Can you please explain what this slide shows? And it's been marked as Exhibit K3.
Yes, I can, and I'm apologize. I'm trying to get this where I can turn it into a laser pointer. If I can find your cursor. This may seem to be maybe a little bit harder than I thought. There we go. These are the two cord wells within the field. They're the bookends for basically the physical rock that we have to calibrate our petrophysical model. Dr. Lindsay spoke at length of both of these and the core analysis, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But I do want to walk you through what you're seeing here. So in the first track here, you will see a gamma ray log as well as a caliper log. And if you have any questions about what any of these mean, I'm more than happy to explain that. And the second track is just a depth track. This is set in sub-C values. In the third track, we have a net low and a net pay flag here. Those are based on our petrophysical model. We ran sensitivities to net pay on the low side as well as net pay on the high side based on the saturations. In addition, you'll see that I have a PE curve. That's a photoelectric factor. It is a mineralogy indicator. As well as a resistivity curve here that I've shaded over 200 ohms. And there's nothing really important about that other than the fact that when we get higher resistivities, we may tend to look at mineralogy factors as well there. In the fourth track here, or the third track, if you really exclude the depth track, we have a neutron porosity as well as a density porosity curve. That density porosity is based on a dolomite matrix. In the fourth track here, we have a sonic curve as well as bulk density. And then in the fifth track here, we have what is called oil saturation. So we have both our low and high case. In the dark green is the low case of what the potential oil saturations would be. And in the lime green would be the high case of what the potential high side of the oil saturations could be. So as you can see on both of these logs, we see oil saturations over, and I apologize, I've gridded this so that you can see it very clearly. Each grid line here is 20% saturation. So as you can see, we have well over 20 to 40% within the Grayburg and the San Andreas 20 to 40% as well. One of the things I want to point out, and I'm going to show this later, is that the importance of setting the stratigraphic model and where we place our top and where Goodnight places their top of the San Andreas is very different. Our tops are based on not only Dr. Lindsay's experience within the field, as he defined these by the core for the top of the San Andreas, but also literature that I've provided in my testimony. It's important when you enter a field to do literature studies to understand what the potential geology is. The studies that I have provided, the type logs that I have provided in my testimony are along the trend of the Artesia Fairway. They define very clearly a marker that's not been discussed very much here, at least yesterday it was not, called the Lovington Sand. The Lovington Sand sits in the middle of the upper San Andres. It is shown, it's been seen in outcrop, it's tied from outcrop to the subsurface. It basically subdivides the upper San Andres. And then below that, we have what's called the pi marker, which is the top of the lower San Andres. So as you can see here, I have a top of San Andres in red. I have the Lovington Sand in brown, and then the lower San Andres in black, and obviously the Glorietta at the bottom of the section, which is the unitized interval, the base of the unitized interval for the San Andres.
And Mr. Bailey, just to make sure it's clear, these two logs that you're here showing on this slide are the RR Bell and the MC 679 that Dr. Lindsay discussed extensively yesterday.
Yeah, that's correct. The RR Bell is on the east side of the field. If you can see in the base maps I provided just above the logs here, you see this green star. That's where the RR Bell sits in the EMSU, and then the 679 is on the west side of out in towards the basin.
And do these logs show oil saturations throughout the San Andres?
They do, where we have data. So the RR Bell actually goes much deeper than the 679, as you can tell by the depth tracks. The 679 actually stops at the Lovington Sand. It goes a little bit below the Lovington Sand. The core interval certainly does. The logs. The red box here that's in track 1 shows you the actual cored interval. So you can see where it was cored. The logs actually don't cover the bottom section of the core, probably because they didn't have enough room for the tools. And then you can see the same on the RR Bell here. You can see the cored interval there goes well below the Lovington Sand as well. So we were able to identify that marker very clearly. Dr. Lindsay has done that and has certainly set us up to be able to correlate the San Andres across the field. In addition, I have also included the Grayberg zone tops in here as well. Those were defined in the commission hearings with the parties that were designing the EMSU the unitization hearings, excuse me. Those Grayberg zones were defined by the RR Bell curve in that document.
And Mr. Bailey, just to be clear, do these logs show oil saturations above 20% throughout the San Andres?
They do, both on the low case and the high case.
And have you reviewed Mr. McGuire's Exhibit B9, which is his cross-section?
I have.
And is it your understanding that Goodnight is arguing that that cross-section shows a 200-foot impermeable barrier between the injection interval and the upper San Andres?
That is correct. And that barrier that they place their top in general, and we'll talk about that in a later slide, but I'll give them in general, they place it at the Lovington Sand marker. Sometimes it's well above that, sometimes it's below it, but in general, they're suggesting that there's a 200-foot barrier there. I mind you that the core permeability in that zone is 0.1 millidarcies. 0.1 millidarcies is not an effective seal.
And this shows a RAWs, in your opinion, below the Lovington Sand.
It does.
What's shown on your next slide, which is
This is a base map, and I've got the San Andres structure here, and we'll go through some structure maps here shortly. I've got several cross sections that I provide in my testimony. Today, I'm going to show you the two dip sections, A to A prime and B to B prime. And then I'm going to show you a top comparison section so you can understand how Goodnight is picking their top. And then I'm going to show you also a perf comparison section. That perf comparison section is based on XTO's perfs within the field that were designated San Andres to the state.
So is this map showing the wells that you use to determine the structure of this?
That is correct, yes.
What's shown on your next slide, which is K10.
Yes, this is dip section A to A prime. As you can see, we've got the EMSU 679 in the second track here. We've got the top of Grayberg very clearly on here. We've got this top of San Andres in the 679. You can very easily see how this correlates across the EMSU and how we come up on structure. It's very recognizable for the top of the San Andres. It tends to be a tight interval at the top of it, as you can see by the neutron and density here. And then obviously we can see the Lovington sand below it, which is a good indicator for basically essentially what you would see about 120 to 140 feet from the top of the Lovington to the top of San Andreas, and thinning up on structure, obviously.
And Mr. Bailey, is the gist of this that down dip to up dip, there are oil saturations all the way through the St. Andreas?
That is correct.
And
More importantly, there are oil saturations below what Goodnight considers their barrier.
Miss Hardy, I apologize. That buzz that you heard is the microphone straining to pick up your voice. Can you bring your microphone just a little closer to you? I apologize.
yes, thank
Thank
you. Thank you. And Mr. Bailey, are the fuchsia markings, well, what do the fuchsia markings indicate?
Yeah, I should have pointed that out. So we tried to run what we would call a baffle, where we would potentially see baffles. So the fuchsia marking that you see on the right side of the EMSU 458, we ran a cutoff of 1.5% effective porosity to try to determine where we might have potential baffles, to understand where Goodnight was coming up with their own baffles in Preston McGuire's testimony. And what you see there is that we do not see any consistent baffles across any of these curves, or any of these wells, excuse me.
And do those baffles constitute a barrier to fluid flow?
They would constitute a barrier, yes, to vertical fluid flow as well as horizontally.
But is it true that they're not contiguous?
They are not consistent or contiguous. There is no regional baffle in the EMSU.
So they wouldn't prevent fluid migration.
They would not.
What's shown here on Exhibit K11?
The K11 is dip section B to B prime. Again, this was just to the south. So we're going from the Rhino SWD, which is Goodnight's SWD well. Again, just illustrating how basically easy it is to correlate the top of the San Andreas across the EMSU, as well as the Lovington Sand and the lower San Andreas. And again, we show here, you'll see that we do have more baffles across here. So there is some more connectivity, mainly towards the upper part of the San Andreas, as well as the upper part of the Grayburg.
And again, those baffles don't show or don't allow for fluid.
They're not consistent across the field. These examples are just well selected to show essentially the structural component of the stratigraphy as well as the stratigraphic model. The baffles that are shown here do not continue anywhere or are inconsistent across the field at all depth levels.
What's shown on Exhibit K13?
Yeah, so this is the most important point to make here. And I want the commission to understand that I've kind of shown you that it's pretty simple to correlate. I don't want to call it simple, but you can correlate the top of the San Andreas across here. And Preston McGuire's testimony, he made the argument that you can't really do it. It's more of an engineering-based top. Okay, that's not geology. That's not fundamental geology, and that's not how you go across a field and correlate sections. And so what we've done, obviously I provided in my testimony several examples of type logs illustrating the Lovington Sand, splitting the upper San Andreas, as well as into the lower San Andreas. And what I want to show here is how Goodnight is correlating their section. Their line on this cross section is the blue line, okay? Our line for the top of the San Andreas is the red line. Mind you, the EMSU 679, we've determined that top of San Andreas by core. Okay, so that's one of our base points for the model. Goodnight and us both agree that the top of the San Andreas in the Rhino well is exactly where we both got it, at around -698 sub C. But as we move across and go up dip of the section, you can see how Goodnight starts to vary their top, and it's really all over the place. And I don't know if it's out of convenience, if it's a lack of fundamental geologic understanding of how to correlate stratigraphy, but I can tell you that it's wrong. And it's important, very important, because what they are doing is they're excluding the upper San Andreas as a RAS zone. Okay, they say he says in his testimony that the top of the San Andreas cannot be correct because the RAS zone is in the lower Grayburg. I will tell you today that that is incorrect. The upper San Andreas contains a RAS zone, as well as below the Lovington Sand contains a RAS zone as well.
And Mr. Bailey, is it your understanding that Goodnight has selected the formation tops based on pressure data?
My understanding is it's pressure data or mud losses. It's not very clear. He just says engineering based data. So
It's not based on geology.
it's not based on geology. No, it's very clearly not based on geology.
Okay. And have Goodnight's formation top picks crossed lithographic and stratigraphic
Yeah,
boundaries?
that's really what's important as a geologist. I mean, you've got to maintain stratigraphic, I guess, integrity, I will call it. You can't cross chronostratigraphic boundaries. These are time boundaries, just so you understand. We understand where the composite sequence boundaries are. We understand where the stratigraphy should tie together. And once you start jumping across those boundaries, well, then you've jumped the shark on understanding what your stratigraphy is.
And what's shown on Exhibit K14?
So Exhibit K14, just in case I haven't convinced you on the top of the San Andres, this is actually XTO wells that were drilled. So in the first column here, in the gamma ray column, you'll see a pink box here. And the perfs that were reported to the state and approved by the state are in this pink box here. So everywhere where they have these perfs below our San Andres top is exactly where they have the San Andres top. Those perfs were designated San Andres and they were approved by the state as San Andres. In the second well, it's the same thing. They actually perfed down well into the San Andres here, as you can see, and their top is right there where I've got it pointed at the red arrow, which is exactly where our top is. They set a bridge plug in the 713. They do not define the actual top of the San Andres here, but their defined zone for their defined bridge plug, the base of the bridge plug is in zone 6 of the Grayberg, which is sitting just above the top of the San Andres. I don't really need their top to actually correlate this. I think you can see with your own eyes, Commission, that it's very easily correlatable across here.
And Mr. Bailey, did you determine your picks for the tops of the formation independently of these tops?
I
picked by
did.
XTO?
I did actually. This was post me correlating across the EMSU unit as well as around the EMSU unit. I actually went back to look to confirm that what we had picked was consistent with what had been reported to the state.
And is it your understanding that XTO sold the unit to Empire based on these top?
Yeah, I want to, that's an excellent point, Dana. So XTO sold this field to Goodnight,
To Empire.
to Empire, based on a RAWS interval below this top, down to 700 feet. Empire bought this field under the premise that they had a RAWS interval within the San Andres that they would be able to exploit at some point in time when they are ready, as they are the operator of the EMSU unit.
What's shown on exhibits K16 and 17?
Yeah, K16 and K17 are the Upper San Andreas structure map and the Grayberg structure map. I want to make this clear that we are on a anticline. I know that Dr. Lindsay talked about a double humped anticline yesterday. I wanted to illustrate that in a map view so that you can understand that we definitely have a structural closure here within the EMSU unit.
And does this show whether there is consistent reservoir thickness?
That will be on the next slide. Let me, just before you go there, just so you understand, I used roughly about 130 wells across the MSU to correlate the Grayberg structure. I believe I'm somewhere at about 90 for the Upper San Andreas and 79 for the Lower San Andreas.
And Mr. Bailey, one other question on this slide. Does fracturing become more pervasive as you are higher on the structure?
Yeah, you would expect, given the tectonics that have occurred here. So Dr. Lindsay spoke about Grayberg deposition, that there was some basement fault block moving as the Grayberg was being deposited. And we'll talk about that in the isopac map next. But you would expect that given the fractures we're seeing down dip in the 679, we've had laramide tectonics, compressional tectonics affect the Permian Basin, as well as basin and range extension in the tertiary as well, that would enhance fracturing. Okay. As you move up on a structure, this is very consistent. We see this in many reservoirs. A great example for fracturing off a reef edge or Sligo or Edwards reef margin for the Austin Chalk, you typically see more enhanced fracturing up on top of the reef or as you come down off the slope margin. Now, this is not a reef. I'm not suggesting that. It's a carbonate ramp. But you would expect that as you come off that structure, you've had flexuring that's going to enhance fracturing, especially up on top of the structure.
And what's shown on exhibits K19 and 20?
K19 is an isopac map. So it's pretty well documented that the Grayberg is on a distally steepening ramp, excuse me. I want to make that point because Mr. McGuire argues that the top of the San Andreas cannot be correct because the Grayberg needs to be 400 feet thick across the whole EMSU. That is just patently false. The Grayberg actually thins up on structure and it thickens out into the basin. So by that basis, I mean, that's documented everywhere in multiple literature papers. The upper San Andreas, or the San Andreas itself, is more on a homoclinal ramp. So you can see by this map, there's not a lot of variation in the upper San Andreas thickness as you go down into the basin, whereas you move off structure for the Grayberg, it begins to expand very quickly.
And what's shown on exhibits K26 and 27?
K26 and K27 is giving you an indication of the lower San Andreas oil saturation percentages. Now, I want to be clear that we go through a process of generating net reservoir maps using cutoffs of a 4% Phi-T, 50% V-clay, and an 80% water saturation. And that 80% water saturation cutoff is because we are under the impression that we need 20% oil saturation to be able to have net reservoir here. So these averages are based on the net pay, okay? And so the net pay averages for the lower San Andreas would be somewhere between 30 to 40% in the lower San Andreas across the EMSU, generally right around 30%. When you look at, that's on the low case. When you look at the potential high case for oil saturation, we can get upwards of 45 to 50% on a single well basis.
And what is shown on exhibits K32 and 33?
This is the original oil in place on a million barrels per section in the lower San Andreas. So as you can see, in general, we're somewhere between 15 to 40 million barrels per section in the low case, and in the high case, we could be anywhere from 25 to 60 million barrels per section. That's a significant amount of volume within the lower San Andreas.
And what's shown on exhibits K39 and 40?
K39 and K40 are going to walk you through the same thing. This is for the upper San Andreas. As you can see, in general, we have oil saturations on average within the net pay that are somewhere in the 28 to 30% range for the low case. And on the high case, we're generally somewhere between 30 to 40% on oil saturations.
And what's shown on exhibits K45 and 46?
This would be the original oil in place for the upper San Andreas. Again, we're showing you that we have somewhere between 10 to 20 million barrels per section within the upper San Andreas on the low case, and on the high case, we're generally somewhere between 20 to 30 million barrels per section. Again, substantial volumes in the upper San Andreas.
And what is shown on exhibits K53?
So this is combined. So now you see the total San Andreas as a whole. And as you can see on the low case, we've got generally somewhere between 25 to 60 million barrels per section on the low case, and on the high case, we're generally somewhere between 30 to 85 million barrels per section. Again, significant volumes for the total San Andreas.
And Mr. Bailey, yesterday, Dr. Lindsay testified about the fact that he didn't have actual core available for part of the interval. But have you made these determinations based on your analysis of the geology and the well logs?
Yeah, so the saturation curves are tied to the core as deep as we have core. And granted, we have two core points that we're working with. So there is a range of possibilities in the lower San Andreas without physical rock data that we cannot tie to. But we've stayed consistent with our model based on the core data we have in the upper San Andreas down into below the Lovington sand, below what they consider their barrier. We have stayed consistent with our model through the lower San Andreas.
And what's shown on exhibits?
Yeah, so this is just a kind of a sum up, just to give you numbers in front of you here. So on a low case OIP, we're talking about 191 million barrels. And on an OIP high case, we're talking about 331 million barrels. And mind you, this is just for the EMSU unit. So this is a total over the whole blue box you see up there that's outlining the MSU. This is giving you an indication of the in-place numbers that are within the upper San Andreas, the lower San Andreas, and the total as a whole. As you can see on the low case, when you look at the total as a whole, we're talking somewhere around 630 million barrels on a low case and over 1 billion barrels on the high case. Those are substantial volumes, gentlemen.
And these conclusions are based on your analysis of the
They are.
logs. And Mr. Bailey, can you please summarize your conclusions for the commission?
I think the point here is that there's a lack of fundamental geology done by Goodnight. I don't think they, or at least they have not illustrated that they understand how the stratigraphy works. They essentially don't have a stratigraphic model, as best I can tell. As best we can tell, they've done everything on an engineering basis. That's fundamentally incorrect. It's unnecessary, given the amount of literature, given the core data that exists here, given the amount of wells that are here. Engineering-based data, I like it. Their model is very similar to something you would do offshore where you have very limited well data. And you need paleo data to tie compartmentalized sands over long distances. It's unnecessary here. It really, it's fascinating that they came up with this model. Again, I don't know if it's out of convenience. I really don't understand how they came up with it, but it's certainly not geology.
And Mr. Bailey, to sum up, in your opinion, are your conclusions and determinations here consistent with the science, XTO's picks, Dr. Lindsay's evaluation?
Yes, I am very confident in our model for the San Andreas. I'm very confident that we have saturations within the upper San Andreas above and below what Goodnight would consider a barrier that is non-existent.
Thank you. Those are all of my direct questions for Mr. Bailey.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hardy. I suspect that, Mr. Rankin, you may have some questions for Mr.
I
Bailey.
do, Mr. Hearing Officer. However, in the midst of the summary, I got kicked off the network. So I may just need a minute or two to get back on and get back on the team so I can share my screen. Sorry for the inconvenience. That was my screen beeping when it was, I got kicked off. So I'm not on right now. I need just to get loud back on. It may take me a moment. I apologize.
Okay, we'll just stay on the record.
Apologize for the delay. Good morning, Mr. Bailey. How are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. So you were present for yesterday's testimony with Dr. Lindsay, correct?
I was, yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. Want to just get a little background on you. I'm going to pull up your rebuttal testimony and just want to understand a little bit more about what your experience has been.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. This is, once I get kicked off the network, it doesn't like, I can't get back into my Adobe. So I'm going to have to just take a moment to restart my Adobe. I apologize. Apologize for the delay. I think, Mr. Bailey, I have here in front of you, once I share my screen, you'll be able to see it. Do you see your CV on your screen here?
Yes, I do.
And that's marked as Exhibit K56, correct?
That is correct.
And this basically outlines your experience and background as a geoscientist.
That is correct.
Just starting from the chronologically here, reverse chronology, you went to University of Alabama,
That is correct.
and that's where you got your master's and undergraduate degrees.
That is correct.
Okay. And now just kind of cruising through these, your experience, you started out with Anadarko, is that right?
That is correct.
And your experience with Anadarko was in unconventional shale drilling mostly, is that right?
Predominantly, yes.
What else did you do for Anadarko?
Cotton Valley Sands in Carthage.
Were those horizontal wells as well?
Not originally, no. They were vertical wells through the Cotton Valley Sands and then horizontal in the Lower Taylor.
So at the time you worked on those projects, were they horizontal development?
No, it was vertical.
Were those conventional
That
reservoirs?
is correct.
Just for the record and just make things clear, I noticed you were doing this with Ms. Hardy as well. Would you just make sure that my questions are completed before you start
Understood.
answering? Because I may shift directions with my question. Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay, so you did a little bit of conventional sands for Anadarko, but predominantly it looks like it was unconventional shale horizontal drilling, correct?
That would be fair.
Okay. Then you were with Anadarko through 2016, and then looks like, actually, sorry, through 2019. And have you had any experience with Anadarko in the Delaware Basin?
Yes, I have.
And how many years have you worked on the Delaware Basin?
Approximately 3.
3 years. Which years were those?
That would be 2016 to the end of 2019 when Oxy bought us out.
Okay. And what were your responsibilities with Anadarko during that time?
I was the geoscience manager for the subsurface and technology team. Ultimately ended up being the asset manager for our Block 1 Monroe area in Ward County in the Delaware Basin.
Okay. In those 3 years, you were on the Texas side?
Yes, I was.
Okay. After you left Anadarko, then you joined JBL Energy Partners. What did they do?
Yeah, so that was a small outfit back in Houston. I moved back from Midland to Houston and was helping them with the Grant Sands up in the Fort Worth Basin.
And what kind of play was that?
That is a sand play, as well as the big conglomerate as well.
As well as being what?
The big conglomerate and the Grant Sands, both.
Okay, with those horizontal? drills?
Yes, it was horizontal sand.
And then you founded Architects Energy Advisors in 2020.
That is correct.
And tell me a little bit about that outfit. What do you do with Architects?
That was my own company. I went out as a consulting geologist on my own. I was working up a prospect for the West Haynesville, developed that prospect and sold it last year to Mitsui.
Tell me, what is the West Haynesville prospect?
West Haynesville Bossier is a shale play on the western side of the East Texas Basin.
Okay. And again, that's a horizontal play?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So you're continuing in that role as a consulting geologist with Architects?
Mainly, I focus on the ops geologic side. Yes.
Okay. And then you formed, co-founded Ops Geologic in 2021. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I joined up with a colleague of mine, actually two colleagues of mine, ex-Anadarko guys, to essentially build a geoscience outfit, consulting from, I'll call it soup to nuts, exploration to execution of operations.
And since you formed that group, tell me a little bit about what kind of work you guys have done. And
We do mainly reservoir characterization. We've worked generally every basin in U.S. onshore, both conventional and unconventional.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the conventional work you've done.
Bird Bear Dupereau in the Bakken. We've done some vertical wells on the CBP. We've done some conventional Cotton Valley work in Carthage again. We've done some conventional recompletes in the Fort Worth Basin within the Grant Sands and the Bing conglomerate. Trying to think what else. Mainly a lot of it's been unconventional horizontal drilling.
Okay. And when you mentioned the acronym CBP,
And Central Bay, sorry. Apologies.
That's all right. I know it's real fun to be, I mean, I know you're eager and you got the answers, but just let me get them out, the questions out. So CBP, Central Basin Platform, correct?
Yeah, Central Basin Platform.
Okay. All right. And what part of the Central Basin Platform were you on there?
Mainly on the Midland side. Well, I guess the Texas side, but down towards the Midland Basin. We've done, sorry.
On the eastern side of the Central Basin Platform?
That's correct.
Okay. On the northern margin of the Central Basin Platform, or down on the southern end of it?
More towards the southern end.
Okay. What's the field out there?
Well, there's several fields. So you've got some shallow intervals, and then Woodford Barnett's been pretty hot on the Central Basin Platform lately. So we've done quite a bit of reservoir characterization on that, as well as the Mississippian Lime.
Okay. And the vertical wells, those are all vertical wells out there?
Well, most of them turned into horizontal wells. Yeah.
Okay.
So our analysis was on the vertical portion of that.
Okay. Just to be clear, I mean, are these pilot holes that you're analyzing, and and then they ended up coming back in and recompleting it as horizontal?
That is correct.
Okay. So they were doing test projects to kind of evaluate the full stratigraphic interval.
Generally, those wells have already been drilled. We're just analyzing up and down the column to understand what the potential for reservoirs are.
Okay, so when you told me that they're vertical wells, that it wasn't a vertical well play. It was just that you were analyzing in the vertical portion of those wells.
That's correct.
Okay. Now I'm not seeing a lot of background or experience in EOR type projects.
That would be fair.
Okay. Have you done any work on EOR projects?
I have not.
When I say EOR, I mean enhanced oil recovery. You're familiar with that term, obviously.
It's tertiary recovery, yes.
What about secondary recovery?
I have not done any water floods either.
Okay. So you've got no experience doing any water floods or evaluating any water floods?
I have not.
Okay. How about, and you've done no work evaluating tertiary recovery post secondary recovery, correct?
I have not.
Okay. Okay. How about in carbonate systems?
And carbonate systems in general?
Yeah.
Yeah. Austin Chalk, like I mentioned, the Bird Bear Dupereau in the Bakken, Mississippian Lime, Chase Council Grove in the Hugoton embayment, Smackover We have a lot of various projects, Adam. I've correlated a lot of wells, a lot across a lot of different basins in the U.S. onshore.
Well, no, it's fair. I appreciate that. I just want to understand what your background is on the carbonate side. Now, all those fields that you talked about just then on that contain or include carbonate systems those were all horizontal wells, correct? That you were looking at.
Smackover's vertical.
Smackover. I love the name of that field. Where is that?
Well, you've got Smackover running the Mejia Talco trend in East Texas all the way up through southern Arkansas and then down in Alabama and Florida.
Smackover trend. Who named that one?
Well, it's named after Smackover, Arkansas, which is where it outcrops.
Okay, that's a great name. Because you identify, so that's okay. So one thing I was interested in at the time when you were with Anadarko, you did some work on a divestment of assets, right?
That is correct.
And part of that job was providing potential upside targets to prospective buyers.
That is correct.
How would you? That's basically pitching a prospect, right, for sale.
That's illustrating that there's upside potential within the asset.
Since this case has a fair bit of discussion about upside potential as it was marketed to Empire from XTO, let me know a little bit about how you go about marketing upside potential. What are you looking at?
We evaluate the reservoir. We look at the reservoir properties. We determine whether it has any value for potential exploration or exploitation, and we generally provide that as an potential upside target to the main pay zone that a company would be looking to acquire.
Okay, so I want to just kind of drill down on that a little bit. Forgive the analogy or metaphor, but I want to understand when you say upside potential, does that generally mean it's a zone or an interval or a development that hasn't yet been established in the field?
It could be infill drilling within, let's just take Eagle Ford for a hypothetical. You might say we have upside potential in the upper Eagle Ford or the lower Chalk, and we prove that based on the reservoir characterization. We may have tests in the ground that illustrate that it has potential.
Okay. So when you're marketing those potential upsides, you put together a package that kind of provides the potential buyer your understanding of what the prospect may be, right? The benefits may be, or how that may be developed, right?
That is correct.
And then on the other side, the potential sellers then would evaluate and assess what you're telling them, right?
That would be their due diligence, I would hope.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on that point, you would expect a buyer, not to take your word for it, right?
I'm going to object to this line of questioning. I don't think they're within the scope of Mr. Bailey's rebuttal. And he's not involved in any evaluation or in the due diligence on the part of Empire.
Well,
I don't think it's relevant.
you all did open the door on this issue, although the question, I think, calls for speculation. How does he know what the buyer is going to do?
Fair enough. Mr. Bailey, as part of your work at Anadarko, did you also work on the acquisition side?
In general, no.
No, just on the sell side.
Yes.
Okay. But as a seller, you would expect a buyer to do some due diligence, right?
I would be speculating, but I would hope so.
Okay, very good. Very good. Well, I think I'll leave my questioning there for now, and I may come back to this area. I mean, the reason I'm asking Mr. Bailey is because you have experience promoting upside potential, and now you're evaluating that exact upside potential that was promoted to Empire in this case. And I think it's relevant to inquire what your experience is and what it means to promote upside potential on a prospect, right? So that's why I'm asking you those questions. And I'll get to this a little bit later, and you'll see why. But I'm laying a foundation here, Mr. Hearing Officer, because what Mr. Bailey is promoting here is, I think it's worthwhile comparing to what XTO promoted. So that's why I want to understand a little bit more about your background and understanding about promoting assets.
Well, just be careful to ask questions and not testify. Mr. Herring.
Sure. Okay, so I think we've covered your background there. Just before I leave that topic on background, have you, and you haven't done anything with residual oil zones, correct?
That is correct.
Have you ever, you've never prior to this date looked at or evaluated a zone that was identified as a potential for a residual oil zone, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, how about any work in the San Andres? Have you done any work in the San Andres anywhere in the Delaware Basin?
It's limited
Where is it limited?
on the CBP.
And that would be on the Midland side.
Mainly, yes.
Have you done any work on the west side of the Central Basin platform?
If you're meaning in the west side in the Delaware Basin, yes.
On the west side of the Central Basin platform, have you done work?
No, I have not,
Okay.
other than what I've done here.
Okay. How about in the Grayburg?
I have not.
What did, let me ask you this question. When were you retained by Empire?
I believe it was September that they approached us, mainly to do a petrophysical model initially.
Okay. Was that sometime in September 2024, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And what did they ask you to do at that time?
We were evaluating a few wells for a petrophysical model.
What wells did they ask you to evaluate?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that answer, Adam.
Okay. Were they wells that had previously been evaluated for petrophysics?
Presumably some of them had, yes.
But you're not sure?
I'm not 100% certain. No.
Okay. Did they discuss with you the fact that they'd already had these wells evaluated by a company called NewTek?
We were aware that NewTek had evaluated some wells for them, yes.
But you're not sure whether they're the same wells that you were looking at. They asked you to evaluate.
I don't want to say one way or the other. That's a question you can ask my petrophysicist. He's next up.
I got it. So you don't know. Okay. Now, when I was reviewing the materials that were provided to us by your colleague, Mr. Burkhead, I noted that he did include in his folders NewTek Energy's original and revised analyses. But you didn't provide me a folder. And so I presume then that you did not yourself look at NewTek's original or revised analyses, did you?
No, that's not my responsibility.
Okay. Now, when I was deposing Dr. Lindsay back in January, we had some discussions, of course, around the Grayburg and the EMSU. And one of the things he told me was that he was working on a new cross section for the unit, and he was working to put that together. Did you have discussions with Dr. Lindsay in preparation for your testimony in these exhibits?
I did, yes.
Did Dr. Lindsay provide you with a cross section of the EMSU that he had prepared?
Yes.
Did you alter or adopt or change in any way the tops that Mr. Lindsay selected for that cross section?
No, I did not.
Okay. So did you yourself actually go through and pick the tops for the San Andres, or did Dr. Lindsay do that for you?
No, I did it myself. It was an independent analysis.
Okay. So you received a cross section from Dr. Lindsay with the San Andres tops, but you also went around and picked your own tops, correct?
I didn't get Dr. Lindsay's cross section until maybe December, so I had already started that process well before speaking with Dr. Lindsay on this.
Okay. Did you change your tops to match Dr. Lindsay's tops?
I did not.
So you varied from the picks that Dr. Lindsay, who is the PhD expert who spent his life working on the field, correct?
I don't know that I varied any of his tops, but I think our tops are pretty consistent across the MSU.
Wait, did you? Okay, let me ask that again. Did you change? Are your tops the same as Dr. Lindsay's tops?
I think they're probably pretty consistent.
Okay, did you double check to confirm? Are there no differences between your tops?
Actually, Dr. Lindsay and I have spoken on a well by well basis, and I think we may be a few feet off here and there, but in general, we're very consistent.
Now, are you aware that Empire provided a list, a structure map to Goodnight at the outset of this case?
I assume so. I don't know. Can you reference what you're talking about?
Are you aware whether or not Empire provided Goodnight a structure map for both the Grayburg and San Andreas at the outset of this case?
I have seen Joe McShane's structure, and I don't know if that's related to what you're talking about. But yes, I've seen previous structure maps to mine.
Okay, so you've seen Mr. McShane's structure map. Have you seen the tops that Mr. McShane picked for both the Grayburg and San Andreas?
I have not.
Okay. So you don't know, as you sit here today, you don't know whether your tops are different or how they might vary from Mr. McShane's tops for either the San Andreas or the Grayburg, correct?
I don't, but I suspect they're probably pretty similar.
Okay, so you haven't looked. So would it surprise you that more than half of your top picks are different than Mr. McShane's?
Maybe, I don't know.
Okay, but you haven't looked, so you don't even know.
I don't know. No.
Okay. Now, okay. So, did Empire provide you their top picks for the San Andreas in preparation for your work?
We had a database with top picks. Yes, correct.
Okay. Did you evaluate your top picks relative to Empire's top picks?
I didn't evaluate my top picks compared to their top picks, but there was certainly some differences in the original. I think his name's Nick Cesari, which I didn't agree with and made my own independent analysis.
So it sounds like there's some disagreements over what the San Andreas top may be, and you actually didn't do all the work to evaluate what other people had done.
As I said, it's
Object to the question. I think Mr. Rankin is tending to testify.
It's an argumentative question.
Okay.
If you'll rephrase it.
Yeah. Okay. I'll drop it. All right. Let's get into your testimony. I've highlighted a phrase here on page. This is your exhibit. Before I get started, Mr. Bailey, let me go ahead and just confirm that this is your exhibit. This is your self-affirmed statement marked as your rebuttal testimony. I believe it's marked as Exhibit K. I extracted it from all the other testimony, so it's 78 pages. I'll just scroll down to the bottom so you can see your signature to confirm it was your signature, and it's dated February 8th, 2025. Is this your testimony?
It is.
All right. So starting off here, I wanted to ask you just a couple of things because I think I got this from your summary, but I just want to make sure. Okay. Essentially, I've highlighted this first phrase here, which says, Goodnight has chosen to use this model, and I presume you're referring to this engineering top or their own top picks, right? Their own stratigraphic model.
It's a great question. It's not a stratigraphic model. I don't know what it is.
So in any event, chosen to use whatever their approach is to argue that there are not any ROZ zones within the San Andreas and thereby support the case for water disposal in the San Andreas, right? Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you are reading that correctly. Yes.
Okay. So, but I think I understood you to say that, and I think you understand this, right? That the dispute in this case is not over what's happening above. I mean, the dispute in this case is not over whether there's a ROZ or oil saturations above Goodnight's disposal zone. Do you understand that?
You're suggesting that my rebuttal is not a rebutting that Preston McGuire said there's no ROZ in the San Andreas?
No, I'm asking you, you understand that the dispute in this case is over whether or not there's an ROZ in the disposal zone where Goodnight's injecting?
I'm not sure I understand where you're coming from on that, Adam.
Okay. Well, let me ask you again. I think you phrased it pretty well. See if I can find it. several times during your summary, you were pointing out that you believe that there are ROZ saturations below Goodnight's barrier, correct?
That is my responsibility, was my responsibility to establish an ROZ within the San Andreas, yes.
Okay. So my point is that the issue, the contention right now in this hearing, in this case, is whether or not there's an ROZ below Goodnight's barrier. Do you agree?
I think there's a contention that the ROZ that you define as an ROZ is within the San Andreas where you define it in the Lower Grayburg, as well as below your barrier where there's an additional ROZ.
Why-
So
Why does what you call an interval matter here?
why does the interval matter?
Why does what you call it matter?
Well, because your geologist said that the ROZ zone is in the Lower Grayburg, not the Upper San Andreas. So you have to establish that.
I guess my point, I think you understand this, is that what's at dispute is whether or not there's producible economic hydrocarbons below Goodnight's barrier. You agree with that at least, right?
I don't. I think the argument here is that you're impairing Empire's ability to exploit their potential ROZ zones.
Okay, so one of those arguments, one of those issues is whether or not there's hydrocarbons below Goodnight's barrier. Agree?
Yeah,
To the
they're
question. I think Mr. Rankin is argumentative in testifying.
It's overruled. Go ahead.
that's fine. There is very clearly oil saturations below what Goodnight considers a barrier. We've very clearly shown that with the core data.
Now, you're not telling me as you sit here that Goodnight's experts didn't evaluate the oil saturations above Goodnight's barrier, are you?
I'm not 100% certain what Mr. McGuire has evaluated.
Okay, let's set aside Mr. McGuire. Have you evaluated or reviewed Netherlands Sewell's oil in place or petrophysics?
My testimony here today is a rebuttal to Preston McGuire.
Okay, so you haven't even looked at Netherlands Sewell's analysis or petrophysics?
I've looked at Dr. Davidson's report, yes.
Okay, so you've looked at it. So you're familiar with where he put oil saturations, correct?
I am.
Okay, so are you telling me that Goodnight's experts did not put oil saturations above its barrier for its disposal zone?
I think they do have oil saturations above the barrier.
Okay. Okay.
You keep referencing a barrier. There is no barrier. So just to be clear.
Let's fine. Just to not argue about it, then let's call it what Goodnight has identified as a barrier. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So, very good. I'll move on from there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull up. I think it's your exhibit K14. And I'm going to scroll down because I think this may help. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. Okay. So in this cross section, you've helpfully identified, because we've been trying to figure this out for some time, where Empire, let me ask you this, does Empire adopt your pick for the top of the San Andreas?
I think it's generally accepted, yes.
Okay. So whatever was presented previously through Mr. McShane is no longer the tops that Empire is adopting?
I object to that question as being outside the scope of Mr. Bailey's testimony. I don't think he's testifying about his opinions.
I need to know what Empire has adopted, what their tops are. It's so important that I need to know. Which one is it?
I mean, we're talking about where the top is. That's been the subject matter of the witness's testimony. So I'm going to allow it. It's overruled.
I'm trying to figure out which testimony to go by here. Okay, is it Mr. McShane's that you told me you haven't really carefully reviewed and you haven't confirmed exactly where your tops are relative to his, or is it yours? So I'm just asking you, have you confirmed with Empire? Does Empire adopt your pick for the top of the San Andreas?
I haven't talked to Empire about adopting anything.
Okay, so you're just giving your own independent assessment of what you think the tops are.
I think I've been very clear. This is an independent analysis.
Okay, very good. Just wanted to make that clear. I think I'm owed that, and I wanted to know. Thank you for confirming. Now, Now, in this model here that you got, your stratigraphic model, you've hopefully identified what you picked for the top of the San Andreas, correct?
That is my top of San Andreas in red, yes.
Okay, and then you've identified here where Goodnight has put its top of the San Andreas in the blue line, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and this is your exhibit K14, just to be clear. So the difference between these two is what you're saying is of critical importance, right? This roughly 200-foot interval between the two picks is what you're saying is unfairly excluded by Goodnight because it eliminates from the San Andreas potential ROZ, correct?
That is correct.
And tell me if you agree with this, that because you reviewed Dr. Davison's petrophysics, right, where you've seen oil saturations in this zone, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So Goodnight's not excluding those oil saturations from the zone. It's just putting them in a different zone, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So that ROZ, those hydrocarbons don't just disappear, do they?
No, his model is actually pretty consistent down to your barrier zone where it changes.
We'll talk about that.
Good. I would like
Yeah, we will. Okay. So I just want to make clear for the record that you're not saying that ROZ is being excluded by Goodnight. It's simply being assigned to a different interval of rock. Agree?
I agree.
Okay. Thank you. Go back up to your testimony. Okay, I guess this comment here, that the second comment here, just along the same lines, you're saying that your model is of critical importance because it shows ROZ in the upper San Andreas as opposed to Goodnight's approach, which shows that there's an ROZ in the Grayburg, right?
That would be fair. Correct.
Okay, and that's kind of what I just talked through with you in K14, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes.
Have you, as I go back to K14, have you evaluated or looked at the perfs in Goodnight's disposal wells?
On a minimal basis, I haven't focused on the perfs and Goodnight's wells. No.
Okay. But you agree, would you agree with me that this interval that we were just talking about that's disputed on K14 between Goodnight's San Andreas top pick and your top pick, that Goodnight's injection is not occurring in that interval?
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Okay, you don't, but you just told me that, okay, so did you look at Goodnight's?
I don't, you're referencing perfs. You're not talking about vertical fluid movement that would be impairing.
Fine, I'm distinguishing. So I'm asking you, are the perfs below Goodnight's injection San Andreas top pick?
They are below the San Andreas top, but your Goodnight San Andreas top.
Okay,
correct.
That's the question I was asking. Okay, I
well,
understand that.
just rephrase it that way. It'd be good.
Okay, I understand that you're saying that there's communication between the two. My question though was whether or not you agree that Goodnight's injection perfs are below its top of San Andreas pick.
That is correct.
Okay. Now, okay. Something we can agree on. You state here in your rebuttal that you agree that the Grayburg and San Andreas are separate geologic intervals, right?
They are separate geologic intervals by time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just explain to me a little bit what that means. When you say something's a separate geologic interval, what does that mean?
We have a unconformity at the top of the upper San Andreas that would, as a period of non-deposition, a period where we have an erosional unconformity, right? That's how we define it. That's a time separation boundary. That's what a sequence boundary is. And so the Grayburg is separate from the San Andreas.
And generally, when you have separate geologic intervals, they generally function as separate reservoirs.
Generally, they can't, depending on the properties themselves. Yes.
Okay. Have you evaluated whether or not the San Andreas and Grayburg here operate as separate reservoirs?
In what capacity, Mr. Rankin?
Well, I'm asking you, I guess, as a reservoir guy that characterizes reservoirs.
I see consistent saturations all the way through the Grayburg and the San Andreas. I think the stratigraphy Outside of anhydrite cements, some varying lithology. In general, these are dolomites. Predominantly, the San Andreas is more dolomite, whereas you might have some you have dolomitized sands predominantly in the Grayberg.
How do you define consistent oil saturations?
Well, you can see it on the cross section. If you'd like to go back to that exhibit, we can show that.
I want to get just sort of a generalized definition of what a consistent oil saturation is.
I've provided that with the ranges in my maps. So you can see, I said there's ranges between 20 to 30, 35% oil saturations throughout the whole column. I think
Okay.
that's fairly consistent.
We'll get to your maps, okay? Because your maps are basically, your maps are interpolating oil saturations between your colleagues, Mr. Burkhead's oil saturation calculations, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so your maps are interpolating through computer software what those oil saturations may be between those points, correct?
No, my maps are based on what Scott works through his petrophysical modeling. He provides me with the output curves for that, and then I go and map it.
Okay, what just so I understand, what are the output curves?
He will provide me with a porosity, water saturation, V clay, bulk density, if he has to make some changes to the matrix. Those are the general output curves.
Just so I have them right, I was trying to write quick. Porosity,
Yes, he will. We correct the porosity back to a dolomite porosity matrix.
water,
Water saturation.
SW, yeah.
Yep. SW and SWT, phi T, which would be total porosity, phi E, which would be effective porosity, V clay as a volume.
Okay.
In some cases where we have source rocks, I will get TOC by weight percent on a modified PASI. There's a lot of different curves that I get output to me. But yes, he has in general his own net pay values as well. I run my own calculations based on his curves to make sure that we're consistent. It is an iterative process, as it should be with good petrophysics and geology, I think.
Yeah. And those were the basis for you. I think you discussed these in your testimony, right? Where you've identified cutoffs for these different values, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I'll come back to that. But those are the curves you're talking about. So he provides you those curves. And maybe I'll save this for when we get into your maps, but essentially, just so I understand as a general overview, he provides you those curves and then you incorporate them into your mapping, yeah?
I go through and do a computation for net pay, okay, using those curves. So I do a net pay, I do an average phi T above the cutoff. So the average porosity within that net pay volume, as well as the average water saturation within that net volume based on the 80% cutoff.
Okay. And then from there you incorporate with your cutoffs into your mapping.
But the cutoffs are in the mapping. So I map the net pay and then map the average porosity, the average water saturation, go from there.
And the maps and the software then interpolates across the map, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So otherwise, I mean, my point is simply that you're taking discrete log readings, interpretations, and then interpolating between those based on your inputs, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So back to my question, which is, how do you define consistent oil saturations? You're finding consistent oil saturations based on your inputs and then the output from your mapping software?
I'm finding it based on the curves Scott has provided me. So 1 minus SW is oil saturation, right? So I can look at the oil saturation all the way through the curves that have been provided to me by the petrophysical model. And I can see that there's consistent oil saturations through the Grayberg all the way down through the San Andreas, into the lower San Andreas.
All right. My question then is, are you defining consistent oil saturations based on Mr. Burkhead's log analyses, the curves and his log analyses, or let me finish. Okay. Sorry. Are you defining consistent oil saturations based on Mr. Burkhead's discrete interpretations on each log? Or are you defining it based on your outputs from your mapping software?
I'm defining it based on the averages that I see on the outputs that I've generated in the maps. Yes.
The maps. Okay.
And the logs themselves. I mean, it's very visible. We can go back to the cross sections. It's easy for anyone to see.
We'll get to the cross sections.
Okay.
I mean, you understand my question. I mean, like the maps are interpolated and Mr. Burkhead's is interpreted, but they're discrete points. And I want to understand if you're saying that I'm interpreting oil saturation as being consistent based on a correlated output from your mapping software versus Mr. Burkhead's discrete analyses of his log interval.
My mapping output represents the petrophysical model. So the curves that he outputs are what the map represents.
I mean, I think we got to the bottom of it.
All right.
Okay.
I'm just making sure. It seems like
All
you
right.
keep circling back around to it.
Well, I like to get to the bottom of things. Okay. I want to make sure I understand. All right. All right. Now, the next sentence here is one that kind of threw me. However, based on fluid communication between the St. Andrews and Grayburg in wells within the EMSU, it is undisputed that these reservoirs are in communication with one another. Mr. Bailey, I mean, the whole reason we're here is because there is a dispute over whether or not there's communication right between these zones. Are you telling me that there's no dispute?
I don't think there's a dispute. I think Chevron made it very clear what your geologist actually uses as a resource or a reference that they made very clear that there was St. Andrews fluid migrating into the Grayburg pre-flood.
Now, did you yourself do an independent evaluation or investigation on whether or not there's communication?
It's basically based on that literature.
Which literature?
It's in my documentation. That's a Chevron paper. I believe it's 1991 EMSU flood.
Was it the one that Dr. Lindsay referred to about, I think it's a 1996 paper?
I think it's
potentially?
1991, but I'm not 100% sure. It's in my documentation. Though.
Okay.
We can review that. Actually, it's in the references if you'd like to go down to that.
Let's see. I wouldn't mind making sure I know which one.
I'd like to too. I don't. Oh, back up. Yeah, there it is. It's sorry. No, I guess I don't have it in there. It should be in there.
Mr. Bailey, I've spent so much time on these papers. I'll represent to you. I believe it's the 1996 paper.
Okay, maybe you're right. If you can you pull that paper up, I'd appreciate that. I believe maybe it was Kearney, Strickland, and Kearney, maybe Strickland et al.
Let's see if I have it here. Is this it?
Yeah, Strickland et al. There you go. You can go down to the exact comment he made.
By the way, this is a Goodnight Exhibit B5 that we're looking at, Mr. Bailey.
Okay.
I think you include this in your testimony, don't you?
I do.
Well, I kind of want to, we can talk about it now. Let me see if I can find where that is in your testimony. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and just switch over to your testimony because I think you do talk about it. And I'm going to,
Well, could we scroll down to the comments that's actually made regarding the testimony?
I'm going to do that 100%.
All right.
I promise. But I
Okay.
also want to kind of put it in context of your testimony.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. So this is page 5 of your testimony, right? And this is the section I believe where you cite to and quote from that paper, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And starting at this bullet here, you say, you quote from it, during the time of primary production prior to unitization and initiating the water flood in the Eunice Monument Field, it goes on, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, and then you go down here and you include some other language from, it's also within quotes, barium sulfate scale has also been detected in surface vessels that are used to process the produced fluids, right?
I do. I think the most important part of this is thus leading to the conclusion that sulfate-rich water found its way into some producing wells before water flood was initiated.
Right.
Would you
So-
agree that the St. Andrews and Grayburg are communicating at that point?
I get to ask questions. Let's go back to Mr. Strickland's paper, okay? So I've highlighted here the portion that you quote in your testimony, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've also highlighted in green a portion that you left out of that quote.
Okay.
You didn't include it.
Okay.
And it says, the portion that you left out says, a possible explanation is shown in the sketch in figure 4,
Okay.
but you didn't include that in your.
Okay.
photo,
Well, I
did you?
apologize. I didn't mean to exclude that.
Well, it's interesting because that's actually an important piece of this
Okay.
assessment.
Let's go through it.
So let's go on down to see what, so just first of all, before I do that, I want to point out a couple of things, okay? Looking at this quote, okay, a couple of things that I think are worth noting because I'm a lawyer and words are important, okay? So the second sentence here, starting with although, says, although the drilling was confined to the Penrose and Grayburg formations, and this is talking about pre-water flood drilling, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, some St. Andrews water was finding its way into the wellbore of these wells and resulted in a barium sulfate scale barite deposition problem. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay, and so the word I wanted to focus on was apparently, right?
Okay.
And now, having read this paper, did you see any documentation or data supporting any of the chemistry conclusions that were made?
I don't know that I reviewed any chemistry conclusions. No.
Okay. I've looked for it and I didn't see any chemistry data or references to databases or actually any data included in this paper showing what they're saying here. Okay.
No, I actually use this reference because your geologist used it as a reference to make the point that there wasn't communication because of chemistry issues. So he is making a point on chemistry issues not being a problem because of San Andreas water being pumped into the Grayburg. But then this statement right here clearly shows that there was apparently Chevron felt like there was San Andreas water migrating into the Grayburg pre-flood.
Right, but you didn't see any documentation or data supporting that speculation about whether there was or wasn't, did you?
I didn't. It was purely a rebuttal to Mr. McGuire's testimony.
Okay. So let's go to figure 4, okay, because I think it's useful as well. Well, before I do that, after the part that you excluded, there's another sentence here. It says production experience strongly suggests that mixing of the water occurs in the producing wellbores rather than in the formation. Did I read that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's not actually saying that there's San Andreas water getting into the formation, right?
I actually disagree with you on the statement that they made that there was San Andreas water migrating into the Grayburg. I don't know how you determine that any other way.
Well, I'm asking you what it says.
It says that the mixing of the water occurs in producing wellbores rather than the formation. I understand what you wrote, but that's
I didn't write it.
or I understand what you're saying, but
Okay.
that's very contradicting to the statement of the waters being San Andreas migrating into the Grayburg pre-flood.
Oh, we didn't say that.
I understand, but I'm saying that there's a contradiction here that clearly they've stated that the waters are migrating from the San Andreas into the Grayburg pre-flood. Do you agree?
I don't agree. This is
You don't agree that that's written on there?
no.
Okay, so let's read right here.
Mr. Bailey, I get to ask the questions, okay? And I'm asking you, and I'm just asking you, to confirm what I read, and you did. And so I think we can move on. So now, the point I'm making, Mr. Bailey, is that what this statement says and what the paper says is that apparently some San Andreas water was making its way into wellbores, not the formation, based on what they said, correct?
Actually, what it says is it is providing sulfate-rich water is coming into the producing wellbores.
Thank you.
Yes.
So let's go down to figure 4 in the paper, okay? Because I think this also will help illustrate that point. Did you look at figure 4 in this paper?
I probably did. I don't recall. I've read a lot of papers.
So you're not sure what it looks like?
I'm not 100% certain.
Okay, let's find out.
It'll be interesting. Let's do it.
Okay, here's figure 4, okay? And I'm just it says what it says and it looks like what it looks like, okay? Figure 4, it's a sketch of how San Andreas water resulted in the formation of barium sulfate scale before the water flood was initiated.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll note that in this figure that they have an image with an arrow pointing up into a wellbore, a producing wellbore, with a notation to the right of it saying bottom water with 4 question marks, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so wouldn't you agree with me that this is not necessarily, it doesn't seem to be a conclusion, it's more a speculation or a question about whether and how this may be happening, correct?
It agreed.
Okay. On that point, in your testimony, um, this is on page 11. I've highlighted here. You state that Chevron concluded that sulfate-rich water made its way into the producing wellbores before the water flood. So you agree with me that it was limited to the wellbores, okay? And you go on to say that Sanders water is sulfate-rich and Grayburg water contains barium. If the two are mixing prior to the water flood, it can only be concluded that San Andreas water is migrating into the Grayburg. My point here, Mr. Bailey, is that you've made a conclusory leap from wellbore to formation.
How else do you propose barium sulfate scale is occurring when sulfate-rich waters in the San Andreas and barium-rich waters are in the Grayburg?
I'm just going off what the Chevron paper says.
Okay. Well, I don't know how to else conclude that. If we've got barium sulfate scale happening, sulfate-rich water has to be migrating into the Grayburg.
I understand that's your conclusion. I'm just pointing out what the paper says.
Okay.
Now I think we went off this track to talk about this paper, and I'm going to see if I can make my way back to where we were. I think we were talking about the fact that whether and to what extent the Grayburg and San Andreas are separate geologic intervals. And I think that was higher up in your testimony here.
It's in the summary, yes.
And my question to you is whether or not you've done an evaluation of whether the Grayburg and San Andreas function as separate reservoirs.
In what capacity?
And that was the same thing you asked me, and my response to you is, well, I guess I'm asking you as a reservoir, as a person that characterizes reservoirs, do you have an opinion about whether or not the Grayburg and San Andreas function as different reservoirs?
I think they are different reservoirs from a geologic standpoint, and that's how I'll place it.
That's fine. Okay, I may come back to this fracture issue.
Mr. Rankin, would this be a good time for the morning break? It seems like I've changed the
I'm
topic.
more than happy to accommodate a break right now. Yeah.
Okay, it's
Yeah, fine.
10:27 and it seems like a different subject matter. So,
Sure.
well, we take 15 minutes, come back at 10:45. get us going again back there?
Yes, we're ready to go.
Jason.
Pardon? Oh, oops.
He's gone.
We're back on the record.
Okay, we need our chairman. Here he is.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Mr. Rankin, you ready to proceed?
Thank you.
Sorry, what?
All right, Mr. Bailey, I think we're back on. So I think we picked up at page 6 of your rebuttal testimony here, and I've highlighted another section that I wanted to talk to you about. Here, I've highlighted a passage where you've said that we define the top of the San Andreas as the tight dolomite sequence approximately 130 to 150 feet above the Lovington Sand and thinning to the east onto the Eunice Monument anticline, where it is approximately 100 feet below the top of the San Andreas in the RR Bell number 4. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Normally, a tight dolomite is normally a good barrier to flow. Agree?
Can be, yes.
Okay. Next, page 7 here of your testimony, you say that in the EMSU 628, the reported perforated intervals by XTO from, and I'm not going to bother to read the depths, are designated as San Andreas, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, what's your basis for saying, in your opinion, that these perfs are designated as San Andreas?
I have exhibits that illustrate that were reported to the state.
Okay. Now, did you evaluate where Goodnight put the San Andreas top in this well?
I don't know that I had a top for Goodnight in this well.
Okay. Are you aware that Goodnight provided all of its top picks to Empire as part of the discovery in these cases?
I am aware, but I don't know that they covered all the wells that I evaluated.
Okay. Did Empire provide to you Goodnight's top picks?
They did.
Okay. So, but for this particular well, you did not look to see if there was a Goodnight top pick for this well.
I don't recall if there was a top pick for this
Okay.
in Goodnight.
So you're not aware that Goodnight had picked the top for this well at 4,088 feet?
I'm not certain on what depth they picked the top. No,
Okay.
sir.
So I'm just going to throw up an XTL well log for this well for the 628. This is from the division's records. Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm going to mark it as Goodnight Cross exhibit number 3. So, Mr. Bailey, this is from Goodnight, from the division's well file for this well. You see that it's got the API number and it identifies this as the Eunice Monument South unit number 628 well. This is the well we're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay. And if I scroll down, first of all, you'll see that it's the operator's XTO Energy, correct?
Correct.
And then I scroll down and it does have the San Andreas and the pick here identified as OCD tops is 4,087 feet. Do you see that?
I see that the OCD has it at 4,087. Yes.
Okay. And would that put it within or outside of your intervals that you identified in your testimony?
That would be below the interval that XTO reported the top depth.
Okay. But you agree with me that this is an XTO document, correct?
I don't know that that's specifically an XTO document. I don't know if the state put that in there or not.
Okay. But it's a different topic than what you had for this well, correct?
If you will go to my exhibits, you'll see the top picks that XTO placed.
Okay. Which exhibit number is it, just so I know?
Dana, do you have that? Apologize.
And your rebuttal testimony?
Yeah, my rebuttal.
It'll just take me a minute to get to it.
I guess, Mr. Bailey, you're going to tell me that you have a different document that shows a different topic, correct?
I have a document reported to the state for the tops of the San Andreas, yes.
Okay.
I do have your rebuttal. I could share my screen if you would like, or
Is it in his rebuttal?
is that what you're referring to, Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, there should be 3 state documents for those wells.
Dan, if you have it, you can tell me the exhibits, I'll move to them.
Not sure which exhibit it is.
It's in the cross section. I have the state exhibits as well. I can provide those.
Okay, maybe during a break, but I guess which cross section has the,
It's the same cross section that we were looking at with the XTO perfs.
I don't remember which one that was.
It's exhibit
K10.
maybe. K14. K14.
Oops, I went past it. Okay. So here's the exhibit K14, and I think the EMSU 628 is the long on the left, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And your pick for the top of the St. Andrews is at about 39. Would you tell me what your definition?
It's probably pretty close, 3918.
3918, okay. And the document I was showing you was deeper, it was about 44,000, just about where Goodnight's pick is, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a difference of opinion in the well file about what that topic is. Would you agree?
I agree.
Okay.
Do you also have the document for 658 that was reported to the state? Selectively. I understand where you're going with this, but 658 also has an OCD top as well.
Okay. Well, I don't, do you have it in your exhibits?
I have it in the state documents, but
Okay.
the same document you showed for 628, which I agree is there in the well file.
Yeah.
If you look at 658 well file, their top for the OCD top is exactly where we have the San Andreas top. So we have a contradiction here.
Yeah. Okay.
But the difference is that the documents, if you read into them, supplied by XTO, show the wellbore with their perfs and the designation for those perfs. And that's the documents that I have that I'd like to provide to you.
Okay. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the next. Oh, Mr. Hearing Officer, I would go ahead and move the admission of that exhibit as Goodnight Cross number 3.
Ms. Hardy, any objection?
No objection.
Any objection from OCD?
No objection, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot,
No objection from Pilot.
it'll be admitted.
Mr. Bailey, you just mentioned the EMSU 658, and I didn't review the well file for that well, but you identify here reported perforated intervals by XTO from 3,995 feet to 4,004 feet, and then 4,018 feet to 4,030 feet, and then 4,074 feet to 4,084 feet. And you say that those are all designated as San Andreas, correct?
Correct.
And you're saying that those are above Goodnight's top of 4,145 feet measured depth, correct?
Correct.
And that's the same cross section we were just looking at, right?
That is in the same cross section.
All right, so I'll just zoop down there real fast. Oops, yeah. 658. Okay, so the 658 is the middle well here, right?
Yes.
And including in your cross section, as you reviewed in your summary testimony, you include on the far right track. I'm sorry, you refer to your company as Ops or OPS,
That's correct.
either one?
I'm sorry, Ops Geologic.
Ops, okay. So Ops Geologic has put together the low and high case based on its petrophysical analysis on the far right track, right?
Correct.
Okay. And the intervals, are you aware that, and I guess you also show these are the perfs here on the left-hand side in your gamma ray track?
That is correct.
Okay. It's a little hard to tell, but from this, but not this entire section was perfed, right?
No, it actually illustrates it as one full column. That's why I designated the depths in there where the perfs were.
Okay, and the perfs are these little markings here.
In general, yeah.
Okay. Are you aware that well down in this section here below what you've tested identified as the San Andreas tested 100% water?
Object to the form of the question. Mr. Rankin is testifying and it's assuming facts that haven't been established.
I'm asking if he's aware of the well file that shows that it tested 100% water.
I think you need to lay a little more foundation.
Okay. Mr. Bailey, as part of your effort to evaluate your reservoir characterization work, did you look at the division well file for this well?
I did not look at the production profile of this well.
You didn't look at the production profile of this well, but you have interpreted production throughout this interval?
I'm sorry, I've interpreted production. I don't see anywhere I've
I'm sorry.
interpreted production.
I misstated. You've interpreted high levels of oil saturation, but you didn't look at whether or not the well has tested in that zone?
I did not look at what that well tested in that zone. It's well understood that the San Andreas is as a RAWS interval does not perform as a main pay zone.
So it was perfed. You knew it was perfed, right?
Yeah.
But that didn't cause you to go look to see if it actually had tested?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Now, as I understand, these increments here on the far right in your saturation curve, those are 20% increments, right?
That is correct.
So if I look at some of the higher levels here, so it's 20%, 40%, 50%, upwards between 50 and 60% in some of these intervals, correct?
It's in general between 20 and 40%. Yes.
In general, but I'm saying there's some highs in here that are above 40%. Don't you agree?
There is, yes.
Okay. Isn't 40% a cutoff for conventional oil generally?
From where?
Well,
That's dependent on wettability, oil properties. There's a lot of factors that determine whether oil is mobile or not, if that's where you're going with that.
Okay, let me ask you, do you have an understanding of what what saturations of oil is going to be mobile here?
I don't know.
Have you evaluated that?
I have not.
Okay. Are you aware of any systems where oil is not mobile at 40%?
I don't think I've ever evaluated mobile oil at 40% in a water wet reservoir as this is.
Have you ever seen a system where you have interpreted oil saturations at 40% or higher where oil is not mobile?
I don't know that I have.
Okay. Now, I think this next section here is page 9 of your testimony. I've highlighted here. You state that net pay, I think this gets into your cutoffs, right?
Yeah, it does. Uh-huh.
Okay. So I think I want to I put that aside because I knew I was going to get to it. Okay. And here we are. So here you state that net pay calculations for both the upper and lower San Andreas were determined using 4% feed.
That's total porosity.
Total porosity. Okay. Cutoff and 80% water saturation cutoff, which because water saturation is the inverse of oil saturation, that gives you your 20% oil saturation cutoff, right?
Water saturation isn't the inverse of oil saturation, Adam. 1 minus SW is oil saturation.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. since I'm not a petrophysicist or a geologist. Okay, so then, and then you've got a 60% volume of clay cutoff, or VCL, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So just kind of generally, maybe you can walk through what's the basis for each of these cutoffs? How did you choose each of these cutoffs?
Generally, in carbonates, we've analyzed across many different basins. We use a 4% Phi-T cutoff, and 80% water saturation cutoff was used because I guess it's been determined that 20% oil saturation is required for a ROS, and a 60% V clay cutoff, and there's very little clay within this system. So.
Okay. And I think you mentioned in your summary that you had resistivity of 200 ohms, right?
That's me just coloring where I have high resistivity. That has nothing to do with the cutoffs.
Okay. Now on the 4%, that was corrected to a dolomite matrix, right?
That Phi-T curve that is generated from Scott was run on a 2.90 matrix.
Okay. And how did you come to the 4%? Why use this 4%?
As I just explained, in general, in our experience with carbonates that we've dealt with, 4% cutoff is a reasonable cutoff for total porosity.
Okay, and the carbonates that you dealt with again were in not in the Delaware Basin, right?
No, we're not dealing with carbonate specifically in the Delaware Basin. No.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the volume of clay, 60% cutoff. Is that, and then you said there's very little clay here. Are you measuring any clay?
Very little clay, and I think that's a better question for Scott.
Okay. So you didn't yourself have any input into that determination, to that that cutoff?
Very minimal input, yeah.
Okay, what input did you have?
I mean, I in general was looking at the cores and trying to understand, do we see very much clay within this system? And I defer to Scott for determining what the cutoff for the V clay would be.
Okay, but in your evaluation of the core, which cores were you looking at?
The 679 and the RBL.
And based on your review of those two cores, you're telling me you didn't see much clay, right?
In my discussions with Scott and our looking at the cores, no.
Okay. Did your identification of any clay affect, or I mean, I guess you're telling me maybe did it affect or evaluate in any way your analysis of the oil in place or the reservoir here?
I'm sorry, rephrase that question.
Yeah. Your determination that there's very little clay or there is some clay in the system, did it affect the petrophysics analysis at all? Is that a question for Mr. Burkhead?
That's a question for Mr. Burkhead.
Okay. Now, you told me that you I think you told me, right, if I'm mistaken, but it was a total porosity of 4%, right?
Correct.
Okay. Because there's some clay, did you also have an effective porosity?
We do have an effective porosity.
What's your effective porosity?
By average effective porosity?
Sure.
I don't know off the top of my head. It's going to be a little bit lower than the total.
You don't know how much lower?
I would be speculating.
Was that, forgive me, because was that part of what your effective porosity would have been a value that would have been provided to us in advance of the hearing?
Yeah, you were provided the petrophysical curves is my understanding.
Okay. So your understanding is that we should have gotten, you expect us to have gotten petrophysical curves that Mr. Burkhead generated?
That would be my expectation.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, because you'd want to know what the effective porosity is, right? If you got some clay and it's a different from total porosity, you'd want to know what the effective porosity is, right?
I mean, if that's up to your petrophysicist.
Okay. But I mean, if we're trying to evaluate where you guys did, we want to know what the difference is between total versus effective, right?
Sure.
Okay. Now, I asked you and you told me that you didn't look at it. So I guess I'm gonna have to direct this to Mr. Burkhead, but you didn't have any discussions with Mr. Burkhead about whether or not these cutoffs were different than what New Tech Energy used in its analysis?
I'm not aware of what cutoffs New Tech used, no.
Okay. Okay. So you didn't look to see if they were the same or different, or how your analysis was different from New Tech's, right?
I think that's a better question for Mr. Burkhead.
Okay, but you didn't yourself.
I didn't do the petrophysical analysis, so no.
How about on the geology side? Did you evaluate whether your geologic interpretation aligned or was conflicting with what New Tech presented?
I would presume that New Tech did not do any stratigraphy, did not do a correlation.
Okay.
That's not what they do.
Did you look to see if they interpreted any clay or shale in their model?
I think they used the Siemens model, so they did have some volume of clay within their model.
Okay, so you know enough that they did use Siemens, but you didn't evaluate to what extent or how they interpreted clay or shale in their model, right?
No, I didn't. That's Mr. Burkhead's responsibility.
Okay. Lots getting shifted over to Mr. Burkhead, I guess.
Well, he ran the petrophysical model, and you're asking petrophysical questions.
Okay.
So
Well, I guess I was asking, it seemed to be also inform your geology. Like if I wanted to understand whether you assessed New Tech's assessment of the system to understand whether you were aligned or not, right? And it sounds like that hadn't happened, right? You didn't look to see if they interpreted clay or shale.
I did not.
Okay. All right. Now, here on the bottom of page 10 of your rebuttal, you identify another passage here I've identified. And here, I'll read it out loud. And while we have fewer wells available for evaluation in the Lower St. Andrews, there are clear zones of interest with oil saturations over 20% and potentially in the range of 40 to 60%. Did I read that right?
Say that again.
Did I read that correctly?
Read again.
Oh,
what you're
sorry.
talking
And while we have fewer wells available for evaluation in the Lower St. Andrews, there are clear zones of interest with oil saturations over 20% and potentially in the range of 40 to 60%, right?
about. That's correct.
Okay. Now, we kind of talked about this already, right? And you told me that you have not evaluated whether or what saturation level oil might be mobile in this system, right?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does because it hasn't been tested.
Okay. And so you don't know at what saturation oil might be mobile, right?
Not in this field, no.
Okay.
Or any field around here, to be honest.
Now, are you aware that, have you looked, let me see how to phrase this. You're aware that obviously that the EMSU is a water flood, correct?
In the Grayburg, yes.
Okay. And are you aware that EMSU has 6 water supply wells that supplied the water for the water flood?
I'm not as certain on how many wells, but I am well, there are water supply wells in the field, correct?
Okay. And as part of your work to evaluate or characterize the reservoir, did you study or identify which of those wells were the water supply wells?
They're marked with a WSW on my map. I didn't specifically, they're within our evaluation if they had the logs to
Okay.
evaluate. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go to your K10. In this cross section here, which I think was designed for the purpose of showing us the tops of the formations, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to draw your attention to the 2 logs on the right, the 457 that I've highlighted here and the 458. Okay. Those 2 wells are 2 of the water supply wells that provided water for the water flood. Were you aware of that?
I'm sure they are. If you tell me they are,
Okay.
I'd have to go back and look.
Okay, but you put them on here and you interpreted them, but you don't know whether they're sitting here, you weren't sure that they were the water supply wells.
I'm be speculating.
Okay. So yeah, I'll represent to you that those two wells are two of the 6 water supply wells that were used to supply water for the purposes of the water flood.
Okay.
Okay. And here in these 2 water supply wells, and again, I think we talked about this, that each of these ticks is a 20% oil saturation, right?
Yes.
And in each of these wells, you've interpreted 20, 40, 60, a high between as high as 60 to 80% oil in the 457, correct?
It is over 60%. Yes.
Okay. And then in the 458, down at the bottom here, 1300 sub C, I'm seeing 20, 30, 40, up to as high as 60% oil saturations in that water supply well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Those are fairly, as you stated, very, very high water oil saturations, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to bring up a map here just for ease of reference. Pictures are always worth 1,000 words, usually, or more. This has been marked as Goodnight Exhibit B8. This is a exhibit in Mr. McGuire's testimony. You reviewed Mr. McGuire's testimony.
I did.
This is a map of some of the wells in the EMSU field, and it includes the location of the water supply wells. As you did, they're marked with a WSW.
Okay.
And the 457 is here in the middle. I'm highlighting it. Okay. And then the 458 is up here in the northeast quarter. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. McGuire's taken the total volumes of water produced from the 457 and he's posted them on this well. 42.2 million barrels have been produced from the 457. Do you see that?
Yes.
You hadn't looked at the well production history for that well before you put that together, that cross section, had you?
No.
Okay. And then the 458 has produced 49.5 million barrels of water. Had you looked at that before you put together that cross section?
Nope.
Okay. Now, going back to that cross section, you're telling me that you don't, as you sit here, you don't think that 60% oil saturation would be mobile?
I think that it probably would. Yes.
Okay. So after producing that volume of water, are you aware that neither of those wells have reported any skim oil or oil production?
I am not.
That hasn't been established, lack of foundation.
You do need.
Mr.
more
Mr.
foundation.
Harwood, Mr. Harwood, I have a concern about this. If we're going to get through this, then I think Mr. Rankin has a good faith basis to ask questions based on what evidence will be put into evidence. And if he's asking those questions on a good faith basis, then it's fair for cross-examination. Unless we want to make Mr. Bailey subject to recall whenever we have these hearings, I think it's entirely proper to ask questions with evidence that Mr. Rankin has a good faith basis to believe will come in.
Well, there's a fine line between having a good faith basis and having evidence in the record.
Well,
to
I think the
establish it.
testimony in the record, I think that testimony is in direct testimony in the record from Goodnight's witnesses, from the evidence of what's been reported on these wells. So that evidence is in the record. He's just asking the question.
Well, as long as it's, all right, as long as the evidence is forthcoming, it's fair game.
Mr. Harwood, I think there's a lack of foundation. I think Mr. Rankin can ask if Mr. Bailey has reviewed the evidence, but the problem is that Mr. Rankin is testifying and he's doing that continuously through his questions instead of just asking the witness a question.
Well, I'm hearing that he's not testifying, that there will be evidence to support the hypothesis that is built into the question. What is the question again, Mr. Rankin?
Mr. Hearing Officer, an offer of proof, I think, would overcome this pretty quickly because of my recollection, there is evidence in the record of this. While OCD is not necessarily intervening in the dispute amongst the operators, I think an offer of proof is a shortcut way to resolve this quickly, and then we can move on.
Well, Mr. Hearing Officer, I appreciate that, and I understand Ms. Farley's concerns. I think we're in a little different circumstance here before the commission. These volumes are are in the division's records. I could ask that the division or commission take administrative record of them. However it wants to be done. I don't think there's any dispute over what the records say or what the volumes are. These volumes were actually provided to us by Empire. So I find it a little bit funny that Empire would object to admission or acknowledgement of what Empire's own records show the volumes were produced from these wells.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection. Remind us of the question.
I was asking Mr. Bailey if he was aware that the 457 had produced 42.2 million barrels of water and whether the 458 well had produced 49.5 million barrels of water. And he said that he wasn't because he didn't look at well, he can see for himself.
I did not look at those volumes. Can you tell me where the perfs are for those wells, please?
Yes, I can.
Love to see that. Do you have a
But I guess I get
representation of those?
that. I guess your counsel can bring that up, but I'm not gonna. You're not asking me questions. I get to ask you questions. But I do know where those perfs are. So. Oh, thank you. So, Mr. Bailey, as part of your reservoir characterization, I mean, so you're not also aware of whether those wells have produced any skim oil or produced any oil, correct?
I can't imagine any, no, I'm not, but I can't imagine anyone here was sitting on the tanks looking if there was skim oil.
Okay. But you're not aware of any records reflecting that any oil production had been recovered from those wells, correct?
I'm not.
Okay. Here on the bottom of page 12 of your testimony, I've highlighted another section here where you're talking about pointing out that there are other CO2 floods in the St. Andrews along the same trend across the Northwest Shelf, the Central Basin Platform, and then you put in parentheses Hobbs, Wasson, Seminole, Vacuum, Means, Hanford, and Goldsmith Landreth units, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because I think not everybody knows where all these are. These are all fields with, first of all, these are all fields with primary production, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay. Primary production in the San Andreas, correct?
I don't know that all of them have primary production in the San Andreas, no.
Okay, so you cite to these fields, but you don't have an understanding of the production history from these fields?
I don't know that all of them are primary producers from the San Andreas.
You're saying you don't know because you didn't look, or you don't know because?
I'm saying these are active CO2 floods in the San Andreas, so they're tertiary recovery efforts.
Okay. But my question though is, are you aware, have you evaluated or determined whether any of those fields, all those fields have undergone primary production in the San Andreas?
I have not evaluated all those fields, no.
Okay. Now, I think I understood you to say that they're on the same trend. What do you mean by the same trend?
They're on the Artesia's fairway trend.
Okay.
So they are in line. They have the same stratigraphy. The Hobbs unit is actually just north of EMSU. Oxy is currently doing a CO2 flood there. So
Okay.
there are several others as well. I think there may be 52 active CO2 floods in the San Andreas at this point. I have to check those numbers, but I think it's pretty close. So it's a pretty hot topic in the CCUS community.
I think it's helpful to have a map. So I'm gonna see if I can find a map real quick. All right, Mr. Bailey, I'm showing here Dr. Lindsay's exhibit B2. Do you see it on your screen?
I do.
Okay. And unfortunately, we don't have a marker for exactly where the EMSU is located, but I'm going to do my best and you can tell me if you agree or not. But city, I believe the Hobbs Field is up here, and I believe the EMSU is just to the southwest, roughly in this location where my cursor is. Is that fair?
Fairly close.
Okay. And then I think you also referenced the fields across the Northwest Shelf, which I believe is fair to say this sort of arc is the Northwest Shelf up here.
Yeah, the whole arc, all the way across down into Hobbs and EMSU.
Okay, so this is the Northwest Shelf, right?
Uh-huh.
You're including
Yes.
the EMSU in the Northwest Shelf?
No, I'm saying that it's on the same Artesia trend. It's got the same
Okay.
stratigraphy.
Okay. But nevertheless, the Northwest Shelf is this sort of arc just above where the EMSU is located, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then these other fields that you reference, the Hobbs, the Wasson, Seminole, Vacuum means, I guess Vacuum's up here on the Northwest Shelf, correct?
Correct.
And the Wasson, I don't think it shows up over here.
It
Here
does.
is.
It's right there in
It's
the
up
north.
here.
Yeah.
Okay. Seminole's over here just on the eastern side of the Central Basin Platform, correct?
Yes.
Means, I think it's not showing up down here, but I think it's also on the eastern side of the Central Basin Platform, correct?
Central to central east. Yes.
Central East. Hanford is also on this eastern side of the Central Basin Platform, correct?
Sure.
Okay. And then the Goldsmith-Landreth units, they're not showing up here, but I think they're roughly in this area here, kind of in the central.
It's pretty close.
Pretty close. Okay. All right. So you're telling me that those fields that we just walked through are all on the same trend as the EMSU, which is to the southwest of Hobbs?
No, what I implied was that they're all CO2 floods in the San Andreas.
You said they're in the same trend.
I said that some of them are on the same trend along the Northwest Shelf and Central Basin Platform.
Okay. I guess your words speak for themselves, but the way I read it is there are currently several active CO2 floods in the San Andreas along the same trend.
The Hobbs is along the same trend. The Vacuum is on the same trend. The Wasson, Means, Hanford, and Smith, Landreth are all on the CBP. So they're all CO2 floods within the San Andreas was my point I was trying to make.
All in the same Andreas. Okay. What do you mean by trend? I mean, generally, I think, I guess I don't know. What does trend mean to you?
I find trends in stratigraphy itself. So I find that the Northwest Shelf running around to the EMSU, the Hobbs, in general, conform to the same stratigraphic nomenclature as well as the same stratigraphy and lithology.
Okay.
Very similar anyway. I also provide those type logs from multiple fields along the Northwest Fairway, confirming the Lovington Sand, as well as this top of the San Andreas. So it's very consistent with ours.
Page 14 of your testimony, I've highlighted a statement here. I think one of the other areas where we agree, you've stated that below Goodnight's top is a dolomite anhydrite unit, but this interval contains porosities well over 4% as well. You agree that that's an anhydrite?
I think it has anhydrite cement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can see that on the photoelectric factor curve.
Okay. How do you calculate porosity for anhydrite?
How do I calculate it? The calculations for porosity are done by Scott. They're also you could pull them off the raw logs for the Defe dolomite. So we have raw bulk density that's converted to porosity, and we can get an indication of what the porosity is. Now, we're not saying this is anhydrite bedding. This is actually anhydrite cements. So that needs to be clarified. There is no anhydrite bedding in the upper San Andreas or in your barrier. Your actual barrier, as you call it, is the Lovington sand. It's actually sand and mudstone. It's not a dolomite or anhydrite at all.
You're finding sand in the San Andreas?
That's the Lovington sand. That's why it's called the Lovington sand.
Is it a siliclastic sand?
It's a dolomitized sand. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not anhydrite. It's I actually misproperly your stratigraphy done by your geologist is incorrect.
Okay, so, but just to be clear, when you refer to it as a sand, it's not a siliclastic sand, it's a dolomitized sand. You're talking about,
sand.
yeah, you're talking about
It's got silica in it, but
okay.
yeah.
You're talking about the size of the grain when you refer to it as a sand?
Yeah, I mean, it's got quartz grains in it. It's been dolomitized.
Okay.
It's had fluids move through it and it's been dolomitized.
This PDF, I'm sorry, page 15 here, I recognize that you're highly critical of Goodnight's approach. So I'm inviting some more criticism, I suppose. But you state here that Mr. McGuire has chosen to ignore the work of many technical experts in the field and their subsurface analyses. Goodnight is using an engineering approach to define the top of the San Andreas based on a purported pressure boundary, as opposed to utilizing lithostratigraphic or chronostratigraphic correlations. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay, just for the benefit of the record and folks, including myself to some extent, would you please explain to us what you mean by a lithostratigraphic correlation?
That is a actual lithology correlation. So
And-
the actual lithology of the formation.
When you talk about lithology, you're talking about rock types?
Rock types, correct.
Okay. And then you're talking about chronostratigraphic. I took a little bit I didn't take Greek, but I know that relates to time. Just explain to us what you mean by chronostratigraphic.
Yeah, those are time surface boundaries. So Goodnight consistently jumps up and down across chronostratigraphic boundaries as well as lithostratigraphic boundaries.
Okay.
And I think I've shown that in my cross section.
Okay. Now, looking, I'm going to pull up an exhibit here. This is Goodnight Exhibit B17. That was part of Mr. McGuire's direct testimony. Did you review this exhibit when you reviewed Mr. McGuire's testimony?
I don't think I specifically reviewed this documentation. No.
Okay. This Exhibit B17 shows on the far left of the table the API numbers for wells in the EMSU. The next column show the well name and well number. And then following in the blue are the Goodnight San Andreas picks in that well. And then the well file pick, what was in the well file that the operator had picked of that well. The next columns in red are the difference between those picks. The ISO interval, in other words, the sort of the depth of the gray, as a result of that pick, what the depth of the Grayberg would be at that location. And then also the final column there is the Goodnight's Grayberg ISO interval for that column. So the one before that, the well file Grayberg ISO, is what would be the resulting interval for the Grayberg based on the well file on that San Andreas pick, and the one to the right is Goodnight's Grayberg ISO interval based on its pick. Okay, do you understand that?
I see it.
Yeah. So I've highlighted two of the wells here just to point out that, you know, what Goodnight picked, for example, in the EMSU 458 for its San Andreas was at 4,050 feet. And that's the same depth as the well file. You see that?
I do.
Okay. And then the biggest difference here between what Goodnight picked and the well file was in the single well, the 461, at least on this table, where there's about almost a 200-foot difference between what Goodnight picked and what the operator that well picked. You see that?
Yeah, that's common with OCD picks and operator picks in the field.
Okay. Now, on this, I mean, the 458, I think in your cross sections, you had the 458, right?
Yes, I have it at the end of one of my cross sections.
And I think you were showing as you were walking through that 458 is higher on structure in the EMSU, right?
That's correct.
Wouldn't you expect that being higher in structure, it would have a shallower top pick?
I'm sorry, for the San Andreas?
Yeah.
It does have a shallower top pick than what you're showing here.
Okay, but this was an operator pick that at the time was Chevron.
Okay.
Okay, and so Chevron was the operator, and they picked the same top that Goodnight picked.
I would argue they picked it wrong.
Okay. No. This is not where I want to be. Apologize. One moment. Okay. Over here on page 17, the statement you make, the pick can be made very clearly, as you stated previously in your summary. And the pick here, I think you're referring to is the San Andreas pick, right?
That is correct.
Okay. The pick can be made very clearly across EMSU, both lithologically and chronostratigraphically, as illustrated in exhibits K10 through K14. So those are the cross-section maps that we talked about already, right?
Correct.
And you mentioned this before, but that there's an erosional boundary between the San Andreas and Grayburg, right?
Correct.
Okay. And I understand that. Well, let me just pull this up and we can just talk about it. This is Goodnight Exhibit B15 that is part of Preston McGuire's direct testimony. I don't know if you reviewed this as part of the documentation that was submitted to the commission back when the EMSU was created as a statutory water flood. Did you review this document as part of your assessment of this field?
I believe I reviewed it, but I've got to get familiar with it. I've slept a lot.
Sure. I'm glad you did. You're one, at least one of us has. So I guess the point that I want to draw your attention to is this highlighting here, where at the time of the formation of the unit, Gulf, actually this is from the technical committee report, I believe, states that the contact between the Grayburg and the San Andreas is gradational, and there's no clear marker for the top of the San Andreas which can be traced across the field. Now I know you're going to tell me you disagree, right?
Yes.
Okay. So my question to you then is, as I understand both Dr. Lindsay's testimony and your testimony, is that you've got two cores that you're using to help identify the top of the San Andreas, correct?
That is correct.
So the RR Bell 4 and the EMSU 679, right?
That is correct.
What specifically are you looking for in the core to identify the top of the San Andreas versus any other erosional boundary or composite sequence boundary that you might exist within that core?
The Premier Sandstone's a pretty good marker in the core. It's the base of the Grayburg.
How is it a good marker? What distinguishes it?
And it's a dolomitic sand that you can see in core.
Okay. And what's the difference between the Premier Sandstone and the Lovington Sandstone?
Depth.
Okay. And otherwise, they're relatively similar.
They're both dolomitized sandstones. Yes.
Okay. And then, so once you've identified the Premier Sandstone based on depth, what are you looking for in the logs? Because you only have two cores, right? How are you correlating the cores to your logs to extend your interpretation of the San Andreas top across the field?
So we can take the depth of the Premier Sandstone in the core, take it back to the log interval, so we know the depth of it, we know the base of it, that is the top of the San Andreas. That can then be correlated across the field.
Okay, so you're just going off depth, measured depths for each well, is that right?
I mean, that's what you would identify what the depth of an interval is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but you're not, I thought I understood you to say that you were looking at signals in the logs to identify.
There's some very clear signals in the log as well.
Okay, what are the signals?
There's a very tight neutron signature at the top of the San Andreas.
And you see that tight neutron signature across the field?
I do. It's got some porosity within it in certain areas, which is likely where we've got some communication between the Grayburg and San Andreas, likely fractures associated with it. I don't know that 100% because we don't have core through it, but speculating that we would.
I guess what I'm wondering is, Mr. Bailey, is because we've gone through a couple instances and have pointed out where there are different top picks in the well files between different operators, and you're telling me that it's really easy to pick, but I'm asking you, in your opinion, though, you're telling me that it's really easy to correlate, right?
I don't know that it's easy, but I think that it's not hard. I think you can common sense correlate your way across here if you understand how to correlate well logs and use all the well logs available.
Okay. It's not easy, but it's not hard. That's your.
I mean, there's certain areas when you're coming up onto the structure itself where you might get some collapse features, You get some expansion of section, maybe there's a bathymetric low. There's some variability across it, but in general, yes, it's especially up on structure, it's very easy to correlate.
Okay. In your cross section, K13 here, just kind of was wondering how this came to be. You've got from left to right. You got from left to right a cross section on the left side. You got the Rhino SWD1, and that's one of Goodnight's active injection wells within the EMSU, right?
Yes.
And then you've got over here this. That's the 679, right?
Yes, 679, EMSU 001, EMSU 628, and EMSU 660.
Okay. Now the EMSU 1, that's do you understand that that is Empire's saltwater disposal well?
Yes, that's Meyer B423 originally, or
Okay.
what it was named before.
Now, in each of the wells you've interpreted, or Ops Geologic has interpreted oil saturations, but not for that well. Is there a reason that that's
Yeah,
the
there's
case?
no density porosity curves.
Okay.
This image is just to show how inconsistent Goodnight's tops are across the EMSU, which is very clear to anybody who looks at it.
But there's a porosity log, right?
I'm sorry, there's a porosity log where.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's not a porosity log. That was your point, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's why we can't do the evaluation. There's no bulk density or neutron.
But there's what's the far right?
That's a sonic log.
Okay. And can you calculate porosity from the sonic log?
You could, yeah.
But you guys didn't do that?
No, we did not. We don't model porosity based off sonic logs. There's a lot of inconsistencies with that methodology.
Okay. But it could have been possible, and you could have actually evaluated whether there was oil saturation in that well too, right?
We would have still needed a neutron log. We don't have a neutron log.
Okay. But you got a resistivity log, right?
We do have a resistivity log, yeah.
Okay. And if you had a resistivity log, but you're telling me you don't model sonic logs to arrive at a porosity.
Well, we need a neutron log also for porosity.
Okay.
That's what's used in the porosity calculation as well.
Okay. In terms of evaluating this field, have you been able to assess what the recovery factors might be in the event RZ development were put in place or evaluated? You know, how to assess what the recovery might be in the ROZ?
That's an engineering question. That's not for me.
Okay. So you haven't, yeah.
That's an engineering question. It's not
Okay.
for me.
Okay. You were here during Dr. Lindsay's testimony yesterday, right?
Yes.
Did you hear him talk about his experience across the street from the Goldsmith units?
I'm sorry, across the street from.
Well, did you hear him talk about his experience with CO2 across the way from the Goldsmith area units?
I listened to a lot of testimony, but you're going to have to be more specific.
Did you hear Dr. Lindsay testify about how in the unit he was working on for CO2 flood, where he experienced moldic porosity, that the CO2 was essentially lost and being sequestered and not creating an oil, I forget the term he used, like an oil wave, or was not contacting or pushing oil through the system?
I don't recall hearing that. I mean, it could have been in his testimony, but I also could have been at the bathroom. I don't know.
Okay. So I'm gonna scroll down here. We'll go into these questions here in a little bit, but I wanted to understand, like, so part of what you did was you took the petrophysical analysis, the oil saturations that Mr. Burkhead prepared, and then you use those to calculate oil in place, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And to do an oil in place calculation, do you need to understand what the oil formation volume is?
We were given an oil formation volume factor
From whom?
from from Empire, sorry.
Okay. And that was an oil formation factor that you used for both the San Andres and the Grayburg?
Yes, it would have been. I actually did not do the Grayburg evaluation. It was not my responsibility. My focus was on the San Andres.
Were you instructed not to assess the Grayburg?
No, for time purposes, my time, they wanted to focus on the San Andres, which
Okay.
is the reason we're here.
So that oil formation volume factor was given to you by Empire. Did you assess whether that was for the San Andres?
We asked specifically for a oil formation volume factor for the San Andres, yes.
Okay. But you don't know, you weren't part of how that bulk oil, that oil formation volume factor was prepared?
No, that came directly from
Okay.
them.
And that was it. So it was the same factor that was used for the upper San Andres as the lower San Andres?
That is correct.
Okay. Okay. Do you know when you calculated these, and this is your structure map, but when you calculated your oil in place maps, you would have used the effective porosity, correct?
No, I used the total porosity as a cutoff.
Okay. Okay. What, just because I'm ignorant of it, would you tell me why you chose the total versus the effective?
That's the determination Scott and I came up with to use a 4% total porosity. In general, as I mentioned, that's what we do with carbonates that we've analyzed before.
Even though you identified some shale content?
I would say the shale content was very minimal.
Okay. All right.
The clay content, let's be specific, not shale, clay content.
Very fine. Well, okay.
And we only have 2 cores to verify that, just so you understand that. Of which we use both, and Goodnight only used one, is my understanding.
I want to ask you a little bit about that as well. And you can tell me if it's more appropriate for Mr. Burkhead, but I wasn't entirely clear, but I want to make sure I understand. When you when you did this work with Mr. Burkhead, did you calibrate your analysis to, as I understood it, it sounds like you calibrated it to the 2 cores, right?
That is correct.
And that was the RR Bell and the EMSU 679, right?
Correct.
Now, because you didn't evaluate what NewTek had done, you don't know how or whether they calibrated their petrophysical analysis, right?
No, I did not speak with NewTek on their petrophysical analysis.
Okay. All right, so let me start with the structure map here. This marked as Exhibit K15, this is your structure map for the lower San Andres, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And reading the structure map, the highest structure is the hotter color, right? Red.
That is correct.
And the lower structure is the cooler colors, the blue, indicating, so as you go to the southwest, you go down dip this direction, right?
That's correct, into the basin.
Yeah. So looking at this, actually, let me go to the upper San Andres. I don't want to be, here we go. This is the one I was more interested in. Okay. So this is K16. This is the upper San Andres, right?
It is.
Okay. And so the red areas are the areas that are above -350, and this is a subsea interval, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And what you're showing here is the portion of the upper San Andreas that are above minus 350 sub C, all in this red, correct?
Correct, 350, at 350 or above, yeah.
Okay. So just looking at this, approximately, what do you think? How many sections are above minus 350 within the EMSU?
How many sections?
Yeah.
What, like, I don't know, maybe 2.5, three, maybe. If I do an average, you're asking me to pick on the orange outside the red. I mean, I can partial that off, but that would be a guesstimate.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking you for, everything that's red, right?
I thought you were asking everything that was outside of that.
Everything above 350, minus 350.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
we've got basically a section and a half of red, essentially.
Okay. Now, now you heard Dr. Lindsay's testimony yesterday, right? And he placed the producing oil water contact at, above which only oil is produced at minus 350 sub C, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So on this map here, where you've got your contour intervals above, cut off at minus 350, everything in the red would have been producing that above that contact, right?
If it was perfed in that interval.
If it was perfect in that interval.
And again, we still have a lot of water to deal with here.
Okay. But we're talking about depths that were above that, right? Minus 350 is above that water, right?
Those intervals were not perfed. Were they perfed in there? I haven't reviewed every single well, but I would have to look at the perfs in the San Andreas to understand whether they were perfed there or not. If they weren't, then no, they didn't produce out of the San Andreas.
Okay, so yeah, I guess you're anticipating my next question, okay, is whether or not you have looked at whether or not any of these wells or any wells in that area have produced oil that you've indicated here, right?
I have not looked at any production of oil in the San Andreas in the MSU.
So if any wells were drilled and completed, okay, and perfed from between minus 350 sub C and above, they would have produced that oil, right?
If there is oil in place there and they perfed that interval and there wasn't a bunch of water associated with it, then maybe it would be.
But you're showing me that
That contact changes, Adam.
Okay, but you're showing me that there is oil in place here, right?
No, I'm showing you a structure map, not even showing you.
Okay,
oil in
let's
place.
go. I'm sorry. You're right. I apologize. So if there is oil in place there and there are wells perfed at those depths, they could have produced oil, right?
That's if there is oil in place there, they would have produced, and they were perfed in the upper San Andreas, they would have produced oil likely, yes.
Okay. And that would have been, and we'll get to your oil in place calculations, but if that's the case, then that would have been included in your calculations for the RZ, right?
My calculation for the OIP section is for the total upper San Andreas. So it goes from the top of the upper San Andreas to the lower. So that's all the net pay within that interval. That's a pretty big interval. Okay. So could be net pay maybe at minus 400, maybe at minus 450. Doesn't mean it's at negative 350.
Okay. No, wrong one. All right, so this is, I think, your upper San Andreas, your average oil saturation high case, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And this is exhibit K40, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is me just making sure I understand. Okay. So as I understand this is showing average oil saturations, right? So if I look at, say, this area here in red, which is the highest oil saturations that you've calculated in the upper San Andreas, right?
Within the net pay interval.
Okay. So everything within that red area would have an average oil saturation of above 40%, right?
Generally around those specific wells, yes.
Okay. So that's the case with each of those areas that are colored in red, right?
Yes, that is the evaluation over those areas for the average oil saturation in the net pay interval.
Okay. So, that's all above, I mean, that's above what conventional oil is considered. Conventional oil is generally considered to be at 40% oil saturations.
I don't know that that's factual everywhere. I really don't. I don't know the answer to that. Can you provide documentation or cite something that specifically says that?
What do you use when you're doing your assessments for clients on what is considered to be a, conventional oil saturation?
We look at what the potential of a reservoir will produce. I don't know that I specifically say that a set oil saturation is going to be producible. I think it varies from field to field, and it takes a little petrophysical work to understand all the factors that might influence that.
But so in your testimony, you told us that, the residual ozone saturation that you're working off of, okay, the assumption you're working off of is 20 to 40% oil saturation, right?
I think in general, we show that it's in that range within the
Okay.
net pay interval, yeah.
So the next interval up from 40% would be considered conventional.
I don't know any specific documentation that says that.
Okay.
Do you have that?
Well, you're saying between 20 and 40% is residual oil. What would be conventional? It would be something above 40%. Right?
What I'm telling you is we calculate oil saturations in the average range of 20 to 40% in the interval. I'm not determining whether it's mobile or not.
Okay, I understand. I guess my point though is that on this map here for the Upper San Andreas, you're calculating saturations that are above what you've defined as residual oil between 20 and 40%. Agree?
These are the average saturations across the Upper San Andreas.
Okay. It is what it is, according to your analysis.
It's pretty clear. It's Upper San Andreas average SO %. High case.
This is your exhibit K45, and I believe it shows the Upper San Andreas oil in place by millions of barrels per section, right?
Yes,
And that's it's your low case.
correct.
Okay. So looking at the contour intervals here, this is millions of barrels, right? So if I'm at the cooler numbers, the blue numbers, looks like you've got parts of the southwest corner of the EMSU are at about, is this between 2 and 4 million barrels? Is that right, per section?
Yes.
And then the more aqua color is between 4 and 6 million barrels per section.
That's correct.
Okay. So just looking at this, it looks like much of the EMSU and the Upper San Andreas has fairly low calculated or estimated oil in place volumes, especially the northwest, west, southwest, and southern part of the unit. Do you agree?
Yeah, we have very little well data out there. It could vary. We don't have any well data to speak of, so it's extrapolating out beyond the points up to the north on the Rice EM SWD 20, as well as the OFC FedCom and the Rice EMS SWD 033M. So it's extrapolating those values based on those wells. We do not have any wells in the northwest corner. I'd also like to point out that Goodnight tends to agree with our rock evaluation because they put all their disposal wells that they're seeking to get permitted up on the structure where the best rock quality is. And those are in the blue diamonds there. You can see those very clearly.
Okay. Based on this map, see. So the highest estimated oil in place values are this relatively discrete area around the EMSU. Which well is that? The 658?
That'd be the 658. That's correct.
And then around the RR Bell number 4 and the 746. That looks like those two are driving the correlation here on the east side of the unit.
Yes, they are.
Okay, and then in this other portion, it's really the 658 and maybe the 628. Is
Yes.
that right? Okay. So those are the highest oil in place as in this zone, right?
Yes.
So in this area, would you expect any recovery of oil by conventional means?
I do not.
Okay, and I asked you this, but I think you're going to tell me the same thing, that you don't know how to you wouldn't be able to calculate a recovery factor for this area.
That's an engineering question.
Yeah. Okay. 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 Let me just take a moment. I know we're getting close to lunch. I'm going to see if I can wrap up before the lunch hour. Mr. Bailey, did you, as part of your reservoir characterization, did you review Goodnight's drilling reports?
I have not, no.
Okay. You mentioned, Mr. Bailey, in your summary, something that caught my ear, and I wanted to ask you about it. You said that XTO sold the EMSU based on the concept that there's a residual oil zone in the field. Do you recall that?
I do. It's down to 700 subsea.
And I'm wondering if you're saying, is it your understanding that Empire is relying on XTO's representations regarding a potential ROZ?
I think that they evaluated that as a potential reservoir that they could eventually exploit with tertiary recovery methods. Yes.
Okay. I guess my question though is your understanding that Empire was relying on those representations?
Object to the foundation. Lack of foundation.
Matt,
I'll allow it. It's overruled.
so my question is, have you had any discussions with Empire? Is it your understanding that they were relying on XTO's representations about whether or not there's a potential ROZ?
I don't know what Goodnight relied on. They probably, I would be speculating, and I'm not going to speculate on something that happened well before several years before I was contacted to do my evaluation.
Okay, just to be clear, you're talking about Empire, right? Not Goodnight.
I'm sorry, Empire.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Okay, but you made a point to make that a point in your summary that XTO was marketing this for ROZ. And I'm wondering why you made that point in your summary, because it's not in your testimony. And I'm wondering why you decided to make that a point.
Yeah, so I found that sales package recently, and I was looking at it I found a cross section within that sales package, and that cross section, this is twofold. That cross section confirms the tops, our stratigraphic model that we're using. Okay, it's very consistent with our stratigraphic model. And number two, they are actually selling on the fact that there is a ROS zone down to -700 subsea, which is well below Goodnight's top and almost down into the lower St. Andrews for us. So I think it's very interesting that Exxon sees a ROS zone down to 700 subsea. They actually marketed their material. People evaluated it. And Empire likely took that into account as they were evaluating that. I don't know if there was a bidding process for this asset. I would be speculating. Maybe they paid for that value. Maybe they didn't. I don't know.
So XTO didn't put an ROZ below -700 feet subsea, did it?
Not in their sales package. No, they didn't.
Okay. So Empire wouldn't be or couldn't be relying on anything XTO marketed below minus 700 sub C, correct?
I don't know. They could have relied on their own evaluation.
I mean, we talked about this a little bit when I first engaged with you, given your experience on promoting upside potential with Anadarko. I mean, your expectation is that a buyer would want to do their own evaluation, correct?
I would, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, I think I may just, if it's appropriate, I just want to make sure I'm done with the witness. Can I double check with my client before we break for lunch, or however the commission prefers to proceed?
How much more do you?
I expect none, but I just want, before I give up the opportunity to ask Mr. Bailey another question, I want to make sure that I don't forego something that my client wants me desperately to ask.
Or how much time do you need to?
2 minutes,
All
1
right.
minute.
All right, well, just stay on the
Okay,
record and
thanks.
take your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. I appreciate the opportunity. I think I have one kind of category of questions, and a small, maybe just only be one question. Mr. Bailey, looking at this oil in place map here for the Upper San Andres, you and I talked about the structure map previously that you had prepared, and we discussed a bit about how the high structures generally in this area, I'm circling with my cursor around the EMSU 658. Do you agree? That's where the high structure is?
Yeah, that's the general trend. Yes.
Okay. And so based on that, where the location of the high structure is, these hot spots with the higher oil in place calculations, that's the only place where you've calculated a high oil in place, which it matches up with your high structure, correct?
It does.
Okay. And so if there were wells completed in these high oil in place intervals in that high structure location, you would have expected them to produce oil, correct?
I don't know that for 100%. It depends on where the net pay is.
Okay.
Could be below that minus 350. It could be at minus 400 where the net pay is.
But you didn't go through and evaluate any of the wells that are completed or perfed or tested in that area, did you?
I don't recall any wells that were perfed down into the San Andres, specifically at the 658 or the EMSU 746 or the RR Bell or the 628. So
Or anything that was perfed above minus 350 sub C, which is
I am not 100% sure. I'd be speculating, so I'm not going to do that.
okay. Very good. No further questions, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Then what's the commission's thoughts on lunch? It's 12:05. What time do you want to reconvene, Mr. Rosados?
I think we should do like we did last time, yesterday, about an hour and 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. So we'll come back if my arithmetic is corrected to 1:20 PM. And we'll pick up with OCD's cross-examination at that time. Okay, thank you all. We'll be off the record for lunch.